Hello, my friend. Welcome to Sleepy Old World. Settle in. Get comfortable. Because tonight we're stepping into the 1950s. Into the 1 hour of the day nobody ever talks about. The hour that came after the husband was asleep, and the children were asleep, and the whole performance of being a proper housewife had finally quietly ended. The things she did in that hour never made it into a single magazine. Pinning her own hair into tight, uncomfortable curls every single night so her morning would look effortless by 7. A small radio playing low in the kitchen, a company she always liked to have there at night. The kind of quiet comfort that never needed a reason. We're going to walk through a great many of these tonight, slowly, one at a time, folded into the story of one particular woman's very ordinary, very extraordinary night. Just a small moment before we begin. If these gentle evenings have become a comfort to you, subscribing would mean more than you know. And if tonight helps ease your mind towards sleep, a like really does keep this little channel going. Tell me in the comments where you're curled up tonight, maybe with the air conditioning humming low somewhere in Texas, or with a fan turning slowly by an open window somewhere in London. I genuinely always read every single one. All right, love, let's begin. The kitchen clock reads 11:40, though she stopped checking it an hour ago, not out of carelessness, but because for the first time all day, the time does not matter anymore. Everyone else in the house is asleep. Not the version of asleep where a child calls out for water in 20 minutes, not yet anyway, but the deep, even kind of asleep that settles over a house like snow, quiet and total and slightly miraculous. The overhead light is off. Only the small lamp above the stove is burning, the one with the yellowed glass shade that has hung there since before she can remember, throwing a low gold circle across the counter and leaving the rest of the kitchen in soft shadow. She's sitting at the table in her robe, a cup of tea cooling slowly in front of her, and she has not moved in several minutes. Maybe she's 31 years old, with 2 children asleep down the hall and a husband asleep in the next room, a man who works with his hands during the day, and falls asleep within minutes of lying down, the way tired men do. Maybe she's a little older than that, with children nearly grown, teenagers who stay out later than she would like and come home smelling of cigarettes they think she cannot smell. Maybe she's the wife of a man who travels for work and is gone 3 nights out of 7, which means some weeks. This quiet hour is not a small gift stolen from a full house. It is simply how the house is, night after night, and she has learned to fill it in her own particular way. Whoever she is tonight, she is somewhere in America, in a kitchen not unlike thousands of other kitchens, at an hour when the whole street outside her window has gone dark except for 1 or 2 porch lights left burning out of habit rather than need. Here is the strange part, the part that does not quite make sense until you sit with it a while. This is, without question, the best hour of her day. Not the morning when the coffee's fresh and the newspaper is folded and everyone is optimistic before the day has had a chance to disappoint anyone. Not the afternoon, with its errands and its telephone calls and its small emergencies. Not even dinner, which she has spent years learning to make look effortless. No, it is this. 11 at night. The dishes long since dried and put away. The floor swept. The lunches made for tomorrow and sitting in the icebox wrapped in wax paper. And nothing left to do. Nothing left that anyone is asking of her. A woman who has spent 16 hours being needed, sitting alone in a kitchen at midnight, and feeling, against all logic, something close to happiness. I find that detail genuinely moving, if I'm honest with you. We tend to imagine these women, the housewives of the 1950s, as figures either to be pitied or admired, trapped in aprons or triumphant in them, and we rarely stop to ask what the actual texture of an ordinary Tuesday night felt like from the inside. Not the magazine version, not the version in the etiquette books or the advertisements for floor wax, the real one. The one that happened after the performance ended and the audience went to bed, because that is really what this hour was, the curtain coming down. During the day she'd been many things to many people, a wife who anticipated her husband's moods before he had finished forming them, a mother who settled arguments and wiped noses and remembered which child was afraid of the dark this month and which one had grown out of it, a neighbour who waved and smiled and occasionally lied about how well things were going when someone asked over the fence, and now at 11:40, with the tea going cold and the house breathing slow and even around her, she was simply herself. Nobody needed anything. Nobody was watching. It is a small thing to say out loud, and an enormous thing to actually feel. The house itself sounds different at this hour, and if you have ever been the last one awake in a sleeping house, you already know exactly what I mean. During the day, a house is full of specific, purposeful sounds, footsteps with somewhere to be, a radio tuned to whatever program the children wanted, the clatter of dishes, a door opening and closing a dozen times an hour. At night, the house makes different sounds entirely, sounds that have nothing to do with anyone's schedule. The particular creak of the floorboard in the upstairs hallway settling as the temperature drops, the refrigerator humming, then clicking off, then humming again a few minutes later, a small mechanical heartbeat she has grown so used to that she would probably notice its absence faster than its presence. Somewhere outside, a dog barks twice at nothing in particular, and then gives it up. The furnace, if it is winter, ticks as the metal cools. If it is summer, there might be the low drone of a window fan, or crickets outside doing whatever it is crickets do until dawn, endlessly, patiently, as if they have nowhere else to be either. She wraps both hands around the teacup, more from habit than because it is still warm enough to need warming from, and looks toward the window over the sink, where her own reflection sits faintly superimposed over the dark yard outside. This is not a woman thinking anything particularly dramatic. She's not composing a letter in her head, not rehearsing a grievance, not planning an escape. Mostly she is just sitting. Which, if you think about it, might be the most radical thing she does all day. Now, before we go further into her evening, and there is quite a lot more to it than tea and quiet, I think it helps to understand what the rest of her day looked like, if only so this hour makes proper sense as the reward it was. Because this was not a leisurely life with occasional bursts of work. It was, for most women of this era, something closer to the reverse, an almost continuous stretch of labour, some of it visible and some of it not, that ran from the moment the alarm clock rang until the moment, hours after everyone else had gone to bed, that she finally allowed herself to stop. The alarm went off that morning, as it did every morning, somewhere between 5:30 and 6, well before her husband needed to be up, because there was coffee to start and a lunch to pack, and a kitchen to warm before anyone else in the house was expected to face it. She would not have called this hardship particularly. It was simply the shape of the day, as familiar and unquestioned as the shape of her own hands. The percolator went on the stove first, that specific rhythmic burble that would become, decades later, one of the sounds people associate most strongly with the whole era, a sound that meant morning the way a rooster meant morning somewhere else. While it worked its way toward that dark, slightly bitter smell that filled the kitchen, she would set the table, his placemat squared to the edge just so. The newspaper retrieved from the front step and folded to the section he liked to start with, and only then would she begin on the eggs. Breakfast fed everyone, but it was rarely a meal she sat down to properly enjoy herself. She stood, mostly. She refilled coffee cups and buttered toast, and answered a child's question about where their shoes had gone, all while somehow also managing her own cup of coffee, which she drank lukewarm, in sips between tasks. By the time her husband left for work, briefcase or lunch pail in hand, kissed on the cheek at the door in a gesture so automatic neither of them thought about it anymore, the day's real work had already begun for her, and it had not even properly started yet. Laundry, if this happened to be a Monday, which in an enormous number of American households it did, because Monday was laundry day the way Sunday was church day, an unwritten rule so widely observed it might as well have been printed on a calendar. The wringer washer in the basement or the back porch. Depending on the house, the specific and slightly dangerous business of feeding wet fabric through the rollers, the clothesline strung across the yard where sheets would hang like sails all morning, snapping gently in whatever wind there was. She pinned each item with a particular practiced economy of motion, learned so young she could not remember learning it at all, the same way she could not remember learning to walk. If it was Tuesday, there was ironing. hours of it sometimes, sheets and shirts and her husband's handkerchiefs pressed into crisp submission, the iron heavy and hot and requiring a kind of attention that left no room for daydreaming, not if you wanted to avoid a scorch mark on your husband's good shirt the night before an important meeting. Wednesday might bring mending, a basket of socks with worn heels and trousers with loosened hems, small repairs that kept clothing serviceable for another season rather than replaced. Thursday, shopping, a walk, or a drive to the market with a list composed the night before, prices tracked with real attention because the household budget, however comfortable, was not infinite, and she was the one who knew, better than her husband ever would, exactly how far a dollar could be made to stretch. And running underneath all of it, every single day, regardless of which specific chore claimed the morning, was the unglamorous, continuous work of simply keeping a house functioning. Meals planned and shopped for and cooked 3 times a day from something close to scratch. Floors swept and swept again, because children and dogs and simple daily living generate an astonishing amount of dust and crumbs and general disorder in the space of 24 hours. Dishes washed by hand in most homes, dried, put away. Children supervised, fed, disciplined gently or firmly depending on the offence, taken to school and collected from school, their scraped knees tended to, their questions answered, their small daily catastrophes absorbed and resolved before they had time to become large ones. There is a phrase that gets used sometimes to describe this kind of work, invisible labour, and I think it is worth pausing on for a moment, because it captures something true. Nobody applauded when the floor got swept. Nobody wrote a report on the meals that got planned and shopped for and cooked without incident. The measure of success in this kind of work was, almost by definition, the absence of anyone noticing that any work had happened at all. A well-run household simply seemed to run itself, and the less visible her effort, the better she was considered to be doing her job. Which is a strange kind of achievement to build a life around, praised most precisely for the moments no one saw you working. She did not, for the most part, resent this, or at least the historical record we have, in letters and diaries and the oral histories collected from women of this generation decades later, does not suggest widespread daily resentment so much as a kind of matter-of-fact acceptance, occasionally interrupted by real exhaustion, occasionally lit up by genuine pride. There is a particular satisfaction, real and not to be dismissed, in a floor that gleams, in a pantry stocked and organised, in a dinner table set with care for people you love. That satisfaction was there for many women, alongside whatever fatigue and frustration also existed, and it would be its own kind of unfairness to flatten the complexity into a single note, either triumphant or tragic. Life rarely arrives in a single note. It arrived, for her, the way it arrives for most of us, in many notes at once, some of them contradicting each other quite happily. But by the time dinner was finished and the dishes were done, somewhere around 7 or 7:30 most evenings, a different phase of the day would begin, one that is talked about far less often, and it is this phase, the last stretch of the evening once the household duties proper had wound down, where the real texture of her private life actually lived. Because here is the thing that gets lost when we imagine these women only through the lens of chores and etiquette rules and girdles cinched too tight. After the dinner dishes were dried and the children were bathed and put to bed, after her husband had settled into his chair with the evening paper or the television, if the family owned one yet, there was often still an hour, sometimes 2, that belonged to nobody but her. And what she did with that hour tells you something about who she actually was, underneath the apron and the schedule and the invisible labour. It tells you what she loved. For a great many women, that hour began, quite simply, with tea. Not always tea exactly. Some preferred coffee even at that hour, or warm milk with a little sugar stirred in, or in the summer months a glass of something cold from the icebox. But the ritual underneath the beverage was remarkably consistent from house to house, the kettle filled and set on the stove, the particular waiting silence while it came to a boil, that stretch of a minute or two where there was genuinely nothing to do but stand there, which in a life this full of tasks was its own small luxury. The tea leaves measured into the pot, or the tea bag lowered into the cup, and then the steeping timed by instinct rather than a clock until the colour looked right. She would carry the cup to the table or to a chair by the window, or in warmer months out onto the back porch, and this was the moment the day actually ended, more than the moment the alarm clock would ring and start it again tomorrow. Not with any ceremony, just a cup and a chair and a house gone quiet enough to hear the tea cooling. Reading filled a great deal of this hour for many women, and it is worth talking honestly about what kind of reading it actually was, because it was rarely the leather-bound classics we might picture when we imagine a woman settling in with a book. It was magazines mostly, the Ladies' Home Journal or McCall's or Good Housekeeping, arriving monthly and read cover to cover over the following weeks, a few pages at a time, at exactly this hour. There were recipes to consider trying, though rarely that week, more often filed away mentally for some future occasion. There were advice columns, the kind that answered letters from women signing themselves worried in Ohio or anonymous in Toledo, describing problems with mothers-in-law or difficult neighbors or husbands who would not help with the children, problems that felt, reading them at midnight in your own quiet kitchen, oddly comforting in their familiarity. You were not the only one. Somewhere out there, a whole magazine's worth of other women were also awake past their husband's bedtime, working through their own small griefs and small victories, one letter at a time. Novels made their appearance too, particularly through book clubs that had begun spreading through American towns in these years, women gathering once a month at somebody's house to discuss whatever title had been selected, and in between those gatherings, the actual reading happened here, at the kitchen table or in a favorite chair, 20 or 30 pages at a stretch before her eyes grew too heavy to continue. Some women kept a small notebook nearby, jotting down favorite lines, or simply the date they finished a book, a private record that nobody else in the house would ever think to look at, let alone read. Then there was mending, though calling it mending undersells what it actually was for a lot of these women, because a great deal of it shaded into something closer to hobby, closer to art, the line between necessary repair and genuine pleasure blurring the longer you sat with a needle in your hand. A sock with a worn heel, stretched over a wooden darning egg, the thread woven back and forth in a small tight weave until the hole simply ceased to exist, a hem let down on a growing child's dress, a button replaced, a seam reinforced. Some of this happened during the day, squeezed between other tasks, but a surprising amount of it happened here, at night, in the lamplight, because it was work that did not require the kitchen or the constant interruption of a ringing telephone or a child's question. It required only her hands and enough light to see the stitches, and the radio playing low in the background. The radio deserves its own moment here, because for most of this decade it was still the primary evening companion in a great many homes, even as television began its slow and eventually total takeover of the American living room. At night, once the children's programs had given way to something more adult, there might be a mystery drama, or a variety show, or simply music, a dance band playing standards that had been popular since she was a young woman herself, songs that carried with them, faintly, the memory of dances attended and courtships conducted in years that already felt, oddly, like another lifetime. She did not always listen closely. Often the radio was less something to attend to than something to exist alongside, a low current of sound that made the silence feel companionable rather than empty, the way some people today might leave a television murmuring in the next room while they do something else entirely. I want to slow down on something for a moment, because I think it is easy to hear all of this, the tea, the mending, the magazine, and imagine it as small, as somehow lesser simply because it was quiet and domestic and largely unremarked upon by history. But there is a version of this hour that I find genuinely worth admiring, which is this. In a life with very few hours that belonged entirely to her, she built, out of almost nothing, a small private world that no one else was invited into. Nobody assigned her the magazine. Nobody instructed her on which radio program to prefer, or which stitch to use on a darning egg, or how long to let the tea steep. These were choices, hers alone, made and remade every single night, in a life where so many of the day's other choices had already been made for her by circumstance, by marriage, by the particular expectations of the particular decade she happened to be living through. There is something quietly defiant in that, even if nobody involved would have used a word like defiant to describe it. A woman claiming an hour for herself, night after night, not by demanding it, not by announcing it, simply by taking it, quietly, the way you might take a breath nobody notices you needing. Some nights the hour took a different shape entirely. There might be letters to write to a sister living 2 states away, or a mother back in the town she herself had grown up in, or a friend from school whose life had gone in a different direction entirely, married to a man stationed overseas, or unmarried altogether and working in a city apartment, living a life that seemed, from this quiet kitchen table, both unimaginable and faintly, guiltily enviable. The letters were long, often, written across several nights, a paragraph or two at a sitting, folded into an envelope only once every scrap of news from the week had been included. The price of eggs, a funny thing the youngest had said, a worry about her husband's mother, phrased carefully, in the particular code that women of this generation used to discuss difficult family members without quite saying anything that could be repeated back to them. Writing these letters by lamplight, the fountain pen scratching softly against the paper, was its own kind of night ritual, and for women whose closest friends and family had scattered across the growing map of post-war America, it was often the only sustained connection they had to the people who had known them longest, who remembered who they had been before they became somebody's wife, somebody's mother, the woman who ran this particular house on this particular street. There were nights, too, when nothing structured happened at all, and I think these are worth mentioning specifically because we tend to assume that rest, real rest, has to look like something. It does not. Some nights she simply sat, the tea went cold in the cup, and she did not particularly mind. She looked out the window at the dark yard, or at nothing in particular, her mind moving slowly through the events of the day, or through nothing at all, a kind of pleasant blankness that a mind rarely gets access to when it is managing a household of small daily emergencies from sunrise to sundown. This is a form of rest that does not photograph well, that would never make it into a magazine advertisement for anything, and precisely because of that, it has mostly disappeared from how we picture this era. But it happened, night after night, in kitchen after kitchen, across a country full of women finally, briefly, doing nothing at all, and needing absolutely no justification for it. Before bed, there was almost always a stop at the vanity, and this too was less a chore than a small private ceremony, one of the few moments in the day where the mirror was consulted, not to check that everything looked correct for the outside world, but simply for herself, alone, with no one grading the results. The jar of cold cream sat waiting, heavy glass with a metal lid that had gone slightly stiff with use, and she would scoop a little onto 2 fingers and work it over her face in slow circles, feeling the day's powder and the last traces of lipstick dissolve and lift away. Underneath was just her own skin, a little tired, a little lined at the corners of the eyes if she had spent the day smiling as much as the role required, and there was something quietly restorative in simply seeing her own face again, without the version she presented at the market or the church social layered over the top of it. Her hair came down next, pins removed one at a time, and set into a small dish that had probably held pins for a decade or more, the same dish, the same particular chip on its rim that she had stopped noticing years ago. She would brush it out, 20 strokes some nights, fewer other nights depending on how heavy her eyes had gotten, and if she wore it set for the week. This might also be the night she wound it into pin curls or rollers, small and tight against her scalp, a slightly uncomfortable architecture she would sleep in, so that tomorrow's hair required less work in the rushed hour before her husband woke. It is a strange, quietly moving image if you sit with it, a woman going to some discomfort in her sleep so that her morning self, the one who would once again be performing for the world, could look effortlessly put together by 7. Even her rest, in a small way, was still in service of tomorrow's presentation, though I do not think she would have described it that way herself. It was simply what you did. Rollers in, a scarf tied loosely over them, and into bed. The seasons changed the shape of this hour considerably, and it is worth spending a little time on that, because the same woman, in the same kitchen, could have an almost entirely different late evening depending on whether it was July or January. In summer, the whole rhythm slowed and spread outward, out of the kitchen and onto the porch, if the house had one, which the vast majority of them did in this era, porches being almost a required feature of the American home rather than an optional luxury. The heat of the day would finally have broken by 9 or 10 at night, and she might carry her tea, or more likely by then, a glass of something cold, out to a wooden chair that had sat in exactly that spot on the porch for as long as anyone could remember, its paint worn thin on the armrests from years of hands resting exactly there. The night air in summer carries sound differently than winter air does, further, clearer, and she could often hear, from several houses down, someone else's radio playing, or a screen door banging twice as a neighbour let the cat out and back in, or the particular electric hum of cicadas that would rise and fall like breathing across the whole neighbourhood. Fireflies moved through the dark yard in slow, uneven arcs. Somewhere a sprinkler that had been left running too long ticked steadily against a fence. This was porch season, and for many families it was also the season of genuine, unhurried neighbourliness, because everyone was outside at this hour trying to escape the heat trapped inside their houses, and conversations happened across low fences and hedges that would never have occurred in the closed-up months of winter. Winter pulled everything back inward, and the late evening hour became something smaller and more contained, centered entirely on whatever heat source the house depended on, a radiator ticking as it cooled, or a furnace grate in the floor that the whole family had, at some point or another, stood over in their socks to warm their feet. The kitchen at this hour in January felt different too, colder at the edges even with the stove's residual warmth, and she might pull a cardigan over her robe, or wrap her hands more tightly around the teacup, less out of habit now and more out of genuine need for the warmth. Outside the window, the yard she had sat looking at all summer was reduced to a pale, snow-covered rectangle, lit faintly by whatever moon there was, and the silence of a winter night carried a different quality entirely, a kind of deep, muffled hush that summer, with its crickets and its distant radios, never quite achieved. There is something particular about the quiet of a snowbound street at midnight that I think most of us, whatever decade we grew up in, recognize instantly, a silence that feels almost solid enough to touch. Autumn and spring split the difference, of course. Evenings when a light sweater sufficed, and the windows could be left cracked an inch to let in air that smelled of either fallen leaves or new growth depending on which direction the season was heading. But regardless of the month, regardless of whether she was on the porch in July or huddled close to the radiator in February, the underlying shape of the hour remained remarkably constant, the house asleep, the work finished, and her awake a little longer than she strictly needed to be, for reasons that had very little to do with anything practical. I want to talk for a moment about a particular object that shows up again and again in accounts of this era, an object that on the surface seems entirely unremarkable, and that is the sewing machine. Most households owned one, often a Singer, black enamelled with gold detailing, treadle operated in older or more rural homes, electric in the newer ones, and it typically sat in a corner of a bedroom or a small sewing room if the house was fortunate enough to have one, under a dedicated cover that came off only when the machine was actually in use. During the day it might handle practical work, hemming curtains, making a child's Halloween costume, altering a dress bought slightly too large because it had been on sale, but at night it became something closer to a creative outlet, and this is a distinction I think is worth making, because it separates the sewing that was strictly obligation from the sewing that was, in its own quiet way, art. A woman piecing together a quilt top, choosing fabric scraps saved from years of dressmaking, arranging them by colour and pattern into a design she had either copied from a pattern book or, in a fair number of cases, invented herself, was doing something that had almost nothing to do with the household's practical needs, and everything to do with a particular kind of satisfaction that comes from making something beautiful with your own hands, on your own time, for no one's approval but your own. Quilting circles existed too, of course, women gathering at each other's houses on a set afternoon to work on a shared project together, trading news and opinions as easily as they traded needle and thread, but the solitary night work at home was its own separate thing, unwitnessed, unhurried, done at whatever pace her eyes and her patience allowed. There was often a small kitchen ritual that came before the tea, or sometimes after it, depending on the woman and the night, and this was the recipe box, a metal or wooden box, usually a gift from a mother or an aunt at her wedding, filled with index cards in a dozen different handwritings, her own, her mother's, a neighbor's careful cursive copied out after a particularly good potluck dish, a few printed cards clipped from the back of a flower bag or a magazine advertisement. At night, with nothing pressing to prepare, she might go through the box simply for the pleasure of it, reading recipes the way another person might read poetry, pausing on ones tied to specific memories. Her grandmother's spice cake, the recipe written in pencil so faded it had to be held at an angle to the lamp to read properly, a neighbor's chicken dish, still marked with a small grease stain from the first time she had made it years ago. She was not planning next week's menu, not really, though sometimes a card would get pulled and set aside for that purpose. Mostly she was simply visiting, the way you might flip through old photographs, except these particular photographs happened to be written in cups and teaspoons. Speaking of photographs, a great many households kept an album, sometimes several, and these too made their occasional appearance in the late evening hour, usually not as a nightly ritual but as an occasional one, brought out perhaps once every few weeks when a particular mood struck her, or when a letter from a relative had arrived that afternoon mentioning a shared memory and she wanted to look at the actual moment again. The photographs themselves were black and white mostly, small and square, corners tucked into little black paper triangles glued to the album page, and looking through them at 11 at night, by lamplight, with everyone else asleep, had a quality that felt almost private, in a way that looking at the same photographs during a daytime family gathering never quite did. Here was her wedding day, herself 20 pounds lighter and considerably less certain of anything, standing beside a younger version of the man currently snoring gently in the next room. Here was her first child as an infant, an expression on the baby's face that made her smile every single time she saw it, regardless of how many times she had already seen it. Here was her own mother, years younger than she herself was now, standing in front of a house that no longer existed, torn down sometime in the intervening years for a project nobody in the family could quite remember the details of. There is something worth noticing in how much of this quiet nighttime activity involved looking backward, toward letters from people who knew her before marriage, toward photographs of a self that no longer quite existed, toward recipes written by hands that in some cases had already stopped writing anything at all. I do not think this was sadness, exactly, though I would not want to pretend melancholy played no part in it. It seems closer to something like tending, the way you might tend a garden that is not currently in bloom, but that you know will need attention eventually. She was keeping threads connected, quietly, night after night, threads to a self and a family, and a history that the demands of the daytime, the breakfasts and the ironing and the school pickups, simply did not leave room to attend to. The household ledger deserves mention too, a task that fell, in the overwhelming majority of these homes, entirely to the woman of the house, regardless of who technically earned the money that filled it. A small notebook, usually, ruled into columns, where every expenditure of the week got recorded in a careful, cramped handwriting that had clearly been doing this exact task for years. Groceries, the milkman's bill, a new pair of shoes for the youngest, whose feet seemed to grow an entire size every few months, in a way that felt, some weeks, like a personal financial conspiracy. She would sit with this ledger some nights, not every night, but often enough, totaling the columns by hand, checking the sum against what remained in the envelope system many households used, cash divided into labeled envelopes for rent, for groceries, for savings, a system that required no bank statement to understand at a glance exactly where the family stood. This was not glamorous work, and it would never appear in a magazine spread about the joys of homemaking, but it was in its own way considerable power, quietly held. She knew, in a way her husband very often did not, precisely how much things cost, precisely where the money went, precisely how much slack existed in any given month, and how much did not. Men of this era were broadly assumed to handle the family's finances, at least in the popular imagination the decade left behind, but the daily granular reality, in an enormous number of households, was that the wife managed the money with an intimacy her husband simply did not have the time or the inclination to match, because she was the one standing in the grocery aisle every week doing the actual comparing of prices, the one deciding whether the family could afford a new winter coat this year, or whether last year's, let out at the seams, would do for one more season. The telephone played its own particular role in these evenings, though its role had shifted somewhat by nightfall from what it had been during the day. Many households, particularly outside the largest cities, still shared what was called a party line. Several families on the same street or the same rural route sharing a single line, distinguished by different ring patterns, 2 short rings for one household, a long and a short for another. During the day, this created its own small social network, women picking up quietly to listen in on a neighbor's call, a practice that was technically frowned upon and universally practiced anyway, a source of both genuine information and considerable, cheerfully acknowledged gossip. By 11 at night, the line usually sat silent, everyone else on the shared circuit having gone to bed, same as her own household. But on the rare occasion it did ring this late, a late call from a sister with news too urgent to wait for morning, a friend whose husband had not yet come home and who needed simply to talk to someone. It carried a particular weight precisely because of the hour. Nobody called at 11 at night in 1950-something unless it actually mattered. Not every night looked the same, and it is worth walking through the shape of a full week, because the late evening hour that anchors this whole story changed its character considerably depending on which night of the week it happened to be. Monday nights, after the exhausting business of laundry day, tended to be quiet ones, an early bedtime more likely than a long stretch of reading or sewing, because Monday had simply taken more out of her than most days did. The wringer washer and the hauling of wet fabric and the endless pinning of items to the line left arms and shoulders aching in a way that made the vanity ritual brief and the bed particularly welcome. Tuesday, similarly, tended toward early nights, the ironing having claimed its own toll on standing legs and a back bent for hours over the board. Wednesday often felt like the middle of the week in every sense, a slight lift in energy, and this was frequently when the sewing basket came out in earnest, or the letters got written, the midweek slump giving way to something closer to her usual rhythm. Thursday, shopping day in many households, tended to bring its own particular late evening activity, unpacking and organizing the week's groceries into the pantry and icebox, sometimes stretching later than intended. The household ledger updated with the week's purchases, while the numbers were still fresh in her memory. Friday carried a different energy entirely, even in households with no particular Friday tradition, because Friday meant the following day did not require the same early alarm, her husband's work week having ended, and this small shift in the household's rhythm made its way into her evening too. Some couples went out on Friday nights, dinner at a modest restaurant if the budget allowed it, or a picture show downtown, and on those nights the late evening ritual we have been describing simply happened a little later, compressed into a shorter window between arriving home and finally climbing into bed. Other Friday nights were quieter, deliberately so, both husband and wife simply enjoying that tomorrow did not demand an early start, and this often meant a longer stretch at the kitchen table together before he went to bed and she stayed up a while longer on her own, the two of them talking in a way the busy weekday evenings rarely allowed. Saturday brought its own particular chores, often the heaviest cleaning of the week, floors scrubbed and windows washed and furniture polished until the whole house smelled faintly of lemon oil. And Saturday nights, depending on the family, might include a dinner with visiting relatives or neighbors, requiring its own performance of hospitality that left her, once the guests had gone and the extra dishes were washed, particularly grateful for the quiet hour that followed. Sunday sat apart from the rest of the week entirely, structured around church in the morning and, for many families, a large midday meal that functioned as the week's centerpiece, a roast or a chicken, the good tablecloth brought out, relatives sometimes in attendance. By Sunday evening, the household had usually settled into something unusually calm, a day of rest observed in practice as much as in principle, and the late evening hour on a Sunday often felt less like a stolen reward carved out of an exhausting day and more like a gentle continuation of a day that had already been gentler than most. She might spend it reading the parts of the Sunday paper she had not gotten to that morning, or simply sitting with her husband in a companionable silence neither of them felt any particular need to fill, both of them aware, without saying so, that Monday and its laundry and its early alarm were waiting just on the other side of midnight. Before any of these evening rituals could properly begin, though, there was almost always a final check on the children, and this deserves its own moment, because for most mothers of this era, it was not a hurried task, but something closer to a small private devotion. She would climb the stairs quietly, avoiding the third step from the top, that had creaked for as long as they had lived in the house, and push open each bedroom door just far enough to see inside, without the hinge announcing her presence. The children's room at this hour looked nothing like it did during the day, when it was a battlefield of scattered toys and half-finished drawings, and the particular chaos that children generate simply by existing in a space for a few hours. At night it was still, moonlight or streetlight falling in a pale rectangle across the floor, and the children themselves looked, in sleep, like slightly younger versions of themselves, faces relaxed into an expression they never quite wore while awake. She would straighten a blanket that had been kicked half off, tuck a stuffed animal back into the crook of an arm where it had clearly been meant to stay, smooth a piece of hair off a forehead with a touch so light it rarely woke them. Sometimes she simply stood in the doorway a moment longer than strictly necessary, watching the slow rise and fall of a small chest under a blanket, listening to the particular quality of a child's breathing during sleep, deeper and more even than an adult's, as though sleep itself were something children had not yet learned to complicate. I think this moment, more than almost any other in her whole day, is worth sitting with, because it contained, compressed into perhaps 90 seconds, most of what her entire day had actually been for. Not the ironing, not the etiquette, not even the marriage particularly, though that mattered too. This, a child asleep, safe, warm, unaware of and entirely unburdened by everything it had taken to arrange that safety. She would pull the door most of the way closed, leaving the small gap some children needed to not wake frightened in the dark, and continue down the hall to check on the next one, and then finally return downstairs to whatever remained of her own hour. Her husband, more often than not, was already asleep by the time she came back down, or would be within the half hour, and the particular texture of their marriage at this hour is worth pausing on too, because it rarely matched the tension or the performance that gets emphasized in a lot of popular retellings of this decade. Many of these marriages, whatever their imperfections, whatever the genuine inequalities baked into their structure by the era's own assumptions, contained real tenderness, real companionship, built up over years of exactly this kind of quiet coexistence. He might grunt something without opening his eyes as she passed through the room, a small acknowledgement that required no response, and she might pause to pull a blanket up over him, the way she had just done for the children, an unconscious echo of the same gesture, the same small act of care, extended without any expectation of it being noticed or thanked. Closing up the house was its own small ceremony, performed in more or less the same order every single night, an order so ingrained that she could probably have completed it with her eyes closed, and on the more exhausted nights she very nearly did. The front door first, checked and locked, the porch light switched off unless it was her habit to leave it burning until morning, a small kindness to anyone who might need to find the right house in the dark. The back door next, same routine, the lock tested with a small tug even after she had just turned it, a habit that had nothing to do with genuine worry and everything to do with simple repetition, the body performing a check the mind had long since stopped needing to consciously perform. The stove got a final glance, the knobs confirmed off even though she knew, with complete certainty, that she had turned them off hours ago, because a woman who has read about a house fire caused by a stove left on, even once, in even one issue of even one magazine, does not entirely trust her own certainty on this particular point ever again. The windows, if it was a season for open windows, were checked to make sure they were cracked only as far as she wanted them, no further, in case of rain overnight or a chill that might drop lower than the evening's mild temperature suggested. In winter, the furnace itself needed attending to in a good many homes, particularly older ones, or ones in more rural areas still running on coal, banking the fire down to a slow, steady burn that would hold through the night without needing to be fed again until morning, a task with its own small satisfaction, watching the coals settle into a dim orange glow that would keep the house from going properly cold while everyone slept. Lights got switched off room by room as she made her way finally toward her own bedroom, the house darkening behind her one lamp at a time, until only the small light in the upstairs hallway remained burning, left on low for a child who might wake in the night needing the bathroom and not wanting to feel their way through total darkness. And then, finally, her own room, where the last of the evening's small rituals, the cold cream, the hairbrush, the rollers would play out before she climbed in beside her sleeping husband and let herself at last actually rest. I keep circling back to this idea of the paradox at the center of her evening, and I want to try naming it more directly now, because I think it is the thing that makes this whole hour worth telling a story about in the first place. By every measure the culture around her would have used to describe a happy life, she should have felt most complete, most fulfilled during the daylight hours, surrounded by her family, actively engaged in the tasks society told her mattered most. Instead, the hour she seemed to treasure most, based on everything we can piece together from letters and diaries and the recollections women of this generation later shared with their own daughters and granddaughters, was the hour when she was, functionally, alone, not unloved, not neglected, simply, briefly unaccompanied, in a house full of people who loved her and needed nothing further from her at that particular moment. This is not really a story about loneliness, whatever it might sound like on the surface. It is closer to a story about the specific, quiet relief of finally not being needed for a little while, after a day built entirely around being needed by everyone else, continuously, from the moment the alarm rang until the moment the last child fell asleep. There is a version of solitude that feels like exile, and there is a version that feels like homecoming, and for a great many women of this decade, the 11 o'clock hour in a sleeping house belonged unmistakably to the second category. She was not hiding from her family. She was simply, for 1 hour out of 24, returning to herself. This decade also sat at a particular hinge point in American domestic life, and some of what made this quiet evening hour feel so significant had to do with exactly where in history it fell. Television had begun arriving in American living rooms in real numbers only a few years earlier, and by the middle of the decade a majority of households owned a set, though plenty of families, particularly in more rural areas or with tighter budgets, still relied primarily on radio well into the decade's second half. For families that had made the purchase, the television often reshaped the entire evening, a shared activity that gathered the whole family into the living room in a way radio, oddly, despite requiring less visual attention, had never quite managed to the same degree. Programs like variety shows and early sitcoms and the occasional live drama drew the family together onto a sofa in a configuration that would have been unfamiliar to households even 5 years earlier. But even in television households, this later hour, after the evening's programs had ended and the set had been switched off, its picture collapsing down to a small bright dot before disappearing entirely, retained its own separate character. The television belonged to the family. This last hour, whatever shape it took, belonged to her. Some women in this decade were beginning, quietly, to want more than the domestic sphere alone could offer, a restlessness that would not find its fullest cultural expression until later years, in books and movements that were still, in the middle of this particular decade, more felt than named. I do not want to overstate this, because for a great many women, the domestic role fit comfortably, chosen and inhabited without any particular sense of confinement, and it would be its own kind of distortion to project a later decade's dissatisfactions backward onto every woman living through this one. But for some, that quiet 11 o'clock hour carried an additional weight beyond simple rest, a small window in which she could, briefly, imagine other versions of her life, other paths not taken, without any obligation to act on any of it. A letter from that unmarried friend working in the city might prompt, for just a moment, a flicker of curiosity about what that life actually felt like day to day. A magazine article about a woman who had gone back to work after her children started school might linger in her mind a little longer than the recipe on the facing page. These were not rebellions. They were simply thoughts, permitted to exist, briefly, in the safety of an hour when nobody was watching and nothing needed to be decided. There were certain nights across the year that stood apart from the ordinary rhythm entirely, and I think they deserve their own mention because they show this late evening ritual bending to accommodate something larger than the usual week. Late summer brought canning season into a great many kitchens, and on those nights the 11 o'clock hour looked nothing like its usual quiet self. The kitchen would still be warm from hours of work, jars sterilized and filled with tomatoes or green beans, or peaches put up for the winter ahead, the whole house smelling of vinegar and sugar and hot glass, and she might still be standing at the stove well past midnight, listening for the particular soft pop of a lid sealing properly as each jar cooled on a towel spread across the counter. This was not the restful version of the late hour. It was its own kind of labor, intense and time-limited, tied to the specific window when a particular vegetable or fruit was at its peak and would not wait for a more convenient week. But even here, in the middle of what was genuinely hard work, there was a version of satisfaction that echoed the same quiet pride she took in her sewing. Rows of jars lined up on the pantry shelf like a small army she had assembled entirely with her own 2 hands, each one a promise to her family that come January, when the garden was buried under snow, there would still be summer sitting right there on the shelf, ready to be opened. December brought its own particular version of the late hour, especially in the weeks leading up to Christmas, when presents needed wrapping in secret after the children had gone to bed, packages hidden in closets or the trunk of the car pulled out one at a time and wrapped at the kitchen table under lamplight, paper folded with the same careful attention she gave to everything else, corners crisp, ribbon curled with the edge of a scissor blade in a technique she had perfected over years of practice. There was a particular thrill to this kind of late-night work that the ordinary evening hour did not quite offer, a small conspiracy conducted in total silence, every creak of the floorboard upstairs sending a brief jolt of alarm through her in case a child had woken and might wander down to catch her in the act. Christmas Eve especially might stretch her awake well past her usual hour, presents finally arranged under the tree, stockings filled with careful attention to which child had asked for which small treat, and by the time she finally climbed the stairs to bed that particular night, the house transformed for morning. There was an exhaustion in her that felt entirely different from an ordinary Tuesday's tiredness, lit through with something closer to genuine joy. Birthdays carried their own quiet version of this too. A cake baked and frosted after the birthday child had gone to sleep the night before, so that the surprise of walking downstairs to find it waiting would land properly in the morning. The kitchen at midnight on the eve of a child's birthday held its own particular warmth, flour still faintly dusting the counter, a bowl of frosting scraped nearly clean, and she would often stand back for a moment once the cake was finished and simply look at it, a small object she had made entirely from scratch that would in a matter of hours mark another year of a life she had brought into the world. I want to spend a little time now on the physical space itself, the kitchen where so much of this hour actually unfolded, because the specific materials and textures of these rooms shaped the experience of the evening in ways that are easy to overlook. The linoleum floor, patterned often in a checkerboard of 2 colors, cool under bare feet even in summer, worn thin in the particular path between the stove and the sink, and the icebox where her feet had traveled thousands upon thousands of times over the years the family had lived in this house. The countertops, formica in newer or more updated kitchens, its surface bright and easy to wipe clean, or in older homes still wood, scarred and stained from years of use, scrubbed pale in places from decades of vigorous cleaning. The icebox, or in more households by this point the electric refrigerator, hummed its steady mechanical presence in the corner, its door heavier than it looked, sealed with a rubber gasket that had a particular smell when you opened it, cool and faintly metallic, mixed with whatever leftovers sat inside wrapped in wax paper. The cabinets above and below the counters were painted, often white or a pale color, chosen to make the room feel bright, their hinges sometimes squeaking in a way she had meant to oil for months and simply never gotten around to. A small imperfection she had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing almost anything that has been part of your daily life long enough. The table itself, where so much of the late evening unfolded, was usually chrome-legged with a formica top in one of the era's particular patterns, boomerangs or flecked patterns in yellow or red, surrounded by matching vinyl-seated chairs that had, over years of daily use, developed their own particular creaks and wobbles that she moved around by memory rather than attention. A single overhead fixture usually lit the room during the day, but at night, in this particular hour, she typically preferred something softer, a single lamp, or the small light over the stove, casting the room in a warmer, more forgiving glow than the flat overhead bulb ever managed. Light matters more than we usually credit it for in terms of how a space actually feels, and there is a real difference between a kitchen lit for the practical business of cooking and a kitchen lit for the quieter business of simply existing in it a while longer than necessary. Outside the window, The yard held its own quiet presence throughout the year, a clothesline strung between two metal poles, a small garden plot along the back fence that might hold tomatoes and beans in summer and sit dark and empty in winter, a swing set or a sandbox if there were young children in the house, its shapes reduced at this hour to soft silhouettes against whatever light the sky offered. A single street lamp down at the corner of the block usually provided the only artificial light beyond what came from the houses themselves, and on a clear night, particularly in the colder months when the air held less moisture, she could often see a genuinely impressive number of stars, more than most of us are used to seeing today, in an era before so much of the country had filled its nights with the particular haze of light pollution that now blots out all but the brightest handful even in many small towns. If you could have risen up above the whole neighborhood at this hour, 11 o'clock on an ordinary weeknight, and looked down at the rooftops the way a bird might, you would have found, I think, a scene both mundane and quietly remarkable. House after house, dark on the upper floors where the family slept, a single window still lit on the ground floor, kitchen or living room, the small glow of a woman still awake a little longer than everyone else in her household. She had no way of knowing this, of course. From inside her own kitchen, she likely felt, on plenty of nights, genuinely alone in this particular habit, as though she alone had discovered some slightly indulgent secret that other, more disciplined wives had already abandoned in favor of proper, timely sleep. She would have been wrong. Up and down her street, and streets like it in towns across the entire country, thousands of women were doing precisely the same thing, at precisely the same hour, each one convinced in her own quiet kitchen that this small ritual belonged to her alone. There is something almost unbearably tender in that image, once you actually picture it properly. An entire generation of women, largely unknown to one another, beyond a friendly wave over the back fence, independently arriving at the exact same solution to the exact same problem, the problem of a day with no hours left over for the self, solved the same way, night after night, in kitchen after kitchen, without any of them ever comparing notes on it. Nobody wrote a magazine article instructing her to do this. Nobody's etiquette book included a chapter on the correct way to sit alone with cooling tea at 11 at night. She figured it out on her own, the way her mother likely had before her, and her mother's mother before that, each generation of women rediscovering, privately, the same simple truth that a life spent entirely in service of others requires, somewhere, an hour that belongs only to yourself, or it eventually breaks something that is very hard to repair. The milkman, in towns where home delivery still operated, which was the overwhelming majority of them through most of this decade, would make his rounds in the very early hours, well before dawn in many routes, the soft clink of glass bottles being exchanged on porches up and down the street, one of the first sounds of the coming morning, hours away from this particular moment, but already, in a sense, waiting on the other side of her sleep. She rarely heard him arrive, being by then long asleep herself, but she would find the fresh bottles on the step when she came down to start the coffee, the cream risen to the top in a way that felt every single morning like a small and reliable promise kept. It is a strange thing to think about, that even in the deepest quiet of this 11 o'clock hour, the machinery of the coming day was already, somewhere out in the dark, beginning to turn again, a truck already loaded, a driver already awake, the whole cycle preparing to start over before she had even finished her tea. Knitting deserves its own moment here too, distinct from the mending and quilting already mentioned, because for many women it occupied a slightly different place in the evening's landscape, less about repair and more purely about creation. A sweater begun in October with the specific intention of finishing it by Christmas, worked a few rows at a time across dozens of these quiet hours, the pattern memorized well enough by the third or fourth repetition that her hands could continue the work almost without her eyes needing to track every stitch, freeing her attention to listen to the radio or simply to think in the particular unfocused way that repetitive handwork seems to invite. There is a specific, steady sound to knitting needles working against each other, a soft click that some women found more soothing than almost anything else available to them at that hour, a rhythm as reliable and unhurried as her own breathing. Embroidery occupied similar territory, though it tended towards smaller, more decorative projects, a set of pillowcases stitched with a simple floral pattern, tea towels embroidered with the days of the week in a cheerful cursive, work that would eventually be given as a gift to a daughter's hope chest perhaps, or to a friend expecting her first child. The hoop held the fabric taut, and she would work the needle through in small, careful stitches, building up color and shape slowly, an hour's work adding perhaps an inch of finished design, the kind of patient labor that modern life, with its emphasis on speed and efficiency, has largely lost the taste for entirely. There was no rush to finish. The finishing was not really the point. The hour itself, spent this particular way, was the point. Music filled these evenings too, beyond whatever came through the radio. Many households owned a record player by this point, and some evenings she might put on a record after everyone else had gone to bed, keeping the volume low enough not to wake anyone, a favorite singer whose voice she had loved since before she was married. Songs that carried inside them the specific memory of a dance, a particular summer, a version of herself 20 years younger standing in a different kitchen entirely, in her own mother's house, listening to these same songs on a much older record player that had long since been given away or worn out. Music does this in a way almost nothing else manages, folding time back on itself, so that hearing a particular song at 41 years old could deposit her, for the space of 3 minutes, directly back into being 19, at a dance she had not thought about in years, wearing a dress she could no longer picture the color of but could somehow still remember the exact feeling of twirling in. Book club nights, when they fell on her calendar, roughly once a month in the households where this custom had taken hold, changed the shape of the evening considerably, though usually earlier in the night rather than at this particular late hour. She and perhaps 6 or 8 other women from the neighborhood would gather at one house or another, coffee and a simple dessert set out, the assigned novel discussed with a seriousness that might have surprised anyone who assumed, wrongly, that these gatherings were purely social cover for gossip. Real opinions got exchanged, real disagreements sometimes surfaced about a character's choices, about whether a particular ending had been earned or not, conversations that gave these women, for one evening a month, a role entirely separate from wife or mother, the role of thinking reader, someone whose judgment on a piece of writing mattered and was taken seriously by the other women in the room. She would come home from these evenings later than usual, and the private hour that followed, once she was back in her own kitchen, often carried a particular charge to it, ideas from the discussion still turning over in her mind as she sat with her tea, occasionally reaching for a pencil to jot down a thought before it slipped away entirely. For some women, faith occupied a quiet corner of this hour as well. A small prayer said not in the more formal manner of Sunday church, but in something closer to private conversation, offered while sitting at the kitchen table or kneeling briefly at the side of the bed before finally climbing in. Not always a request for anything in particular, sometimes simply a gratitude, offered in plain, unpolished language, very different from the more formal prayers recited at church. Thanks for a healthy family, for a roof that did not leak, for a husband who, whatever his flaws, came home every night and had never once raised a hand to her, a small mercy that she understood, from conversations occasionally overheard or confided by other women in the neighborhood. Not every wife in America could count on. This kind of quiet faith rarely announced itself. It simply existed, folded into the evening the way the tea and the mending were folded in, one more small ritual among several, offering its own particular kind of comfort to whoever practiced it. A diary, kept by some women, though certainly not all, might receive its entry at this hour too, a few lines rather than pages, the day's events compressed into whatever space felt necessary. Nothing happened today worth writing down, and then, underneath that very sentence, a full paragraph about something that clearly had happened, a phone call from her sister, a small argument with her husband resolved before dinner, a moment with one of the children that had made her laugh out loud, alone in the kitchen, hours after it occurred. These diaries, where they survive at all, tend to reveal a person considerably more complicated and considerably funnier than the flattened cultural memory of the 1950s housewife generally allows for. Wry observations about the neighbors, genuine affection for a husband, described in terms that would surprise anyone assuming these marriages were purely transactional arrangements built on obligation rather than actual love, occasional flashes of real frustration, quickly noted and just as quickly set aside, the diary functioning less as a record for posterity and more as a kind of pressure valve, a place to put down briefly whatever needed putting down before sleep could properly arrive. I think it is worth pausing here to imagine a second woman for a moment, because the picture we have been building, however true to a great many households, was not universal, and history rarely moves in a single uniform pattern across an entire population. Maybe this second woman's husband works nights at a factory running a late shift, which means her own evening unfolds in an almost inverted rhythm from the one we have been describing. Her quiet hour might actually fall earlier, once the children are down but before her husband leaves for his shift around 11, the two of them sharing a cup of coffee at the kitchen table in a strange, private version of breakfast, conducted well after most of the street has gone to sleep. Or maybe, once he has left for work, her quiet hour stretches out considerably longer than most of her neighbours, the whole house entirely her own, until the early hours of morning, when he would finally return home just as she was waking the children for school, the two of them passing each other in the hallway like figures on a schedule built for entirely different clocks. Maybe this second woman is not married at all, a widow perhaps, her husband lost in the war a decade earlier, or to illness more recently, running her household alone with whatever combination of a small pension, family help, or her own work outside the home could sustain it. Her evening hour carries a different weight entirely, less a brief escape from a full house, and more, some nights, the whole of a quiet evening spread out before her, no husband asleep in the next room at all, just herself and whichever children remained at home, and on the hardest nights this quiet could tip from restful into something closer to lonely, though on plenty of other nights it simply felt like her own particular version of peace, hard-won and genuinely hers. Or maybe she works outside the home herself. A growing number of women did by this point in the decade, in offices or shops or occasionally in professions their own mothers would never have had access to, and her late evening hour, after the additional demands of a job layered on top of the household work that somehow still fell primarily to her regardless of what she did during business hours, might be shorter than her neighbours, her exhaustion by 11 at night considerably deeper, but perhaps also carrying its own particular satisfaction, a paycheck of her own, a version of purpose that extended beyond the walls of this house, however narrow the path toward that purpose might have been for a woman of this particular decade. Whichever version of her we are picturing, though, whatever specific shape her household and her marriage and her circumstances happen to take, the underlying architecture of the evening tends to hold remarkably steady across all of them. Work, extending in most cases well beyond what any outside observer would have recognized as a full day's labor. A brief window, however it was carved out, and whatever hour it happened to fall in, that belonged entirely to her. And beneath all of it, whether spoken aloud or simply felt, a particular kind of quiet dignity in having gotten through another day, the house still standing, the family still fed and clothed and loved, whatever the day's specific difficulties had been. Let us walk for a while now, more slowly through the actual texture of a single evening, hour by hour, the way it might have unfolded start to finish in one particular house, because I think there is something worth savouring in following it all the way through, rather than skipping between its individual pieces. 9 o'clock finds her still at the sink, the dinner dishes not yet finished, her husband settled in the front room with the newspaper or the television, the children upstairs supposedly getting ready for bed, though the actual process of getting 2 or 3 young children into pyjamas and through teeth brushing tends to stretch considerably longer than logic would suggest it should. The water in the sink has gone lukewarm by now, grey with the last traces of soap, and she works through the final pots methodically, the roasting pan that always takes the longest, its bottom scrubbed with a wire brush, until the last stubborn bits finally release. Her hands, submerged in water for most of the last 20 minutes, have gone slightly pruned at the fingertips, a small physical detail she notices and dismisses without any particular thought, the way you notice 100 small physical sensations across a day without any of them requiring your actual attention. The window above the sink, dark now, holds her own reflection faintly against the black glass, and behind that reflection, if she looks closely, the first stars of the evening, appearing gradually as the last of the daylight finishes draining out of the sky. She dries her hands on the towel hanging from the oven door handle, its terry cloth gone soft and slightly threadbare from years of exactly this use, and turns to survey the kitchen, mentally checking it against some internal standard that has been drilled into her since she was young enough to be handed a dish towel and told to help. Counters wiped, stove clean. Floor, she notices, could use a quick sweep, a few crumbs scattered near the table where dinner's inevitable small messes had landed, and she takes care of this now rather than leaving it, because a kitchen left less than fully in order does not sit easily with her, whatever the hour. By 9:30, the children's teeth-brushing negotiations have finally resolved themselves, and she climbs the stairs to referee the last stage of the evening, story time, a chapter or two from whatever book currently holds their attention, read aloud in the particular voice she has developed over years of doing exactly this, slightly slower than her ordinary speaking voice, with small dramatic pauses in the places she has learned, through trial and error, tend to hold a child's attention best. The youngest usually drifts off before the chapter ends entirely, and she reads the last few pages quietly to the older one alone, both of them aware, without either saying so, that this particular nightly ritual has a limited number of years left in it before he considers himself too old for being read to at all, a thought that she does not dwell on for long, because dwelling on it too long tends to bring an ache she would rather not examine too closely at 9:30 on an ordinary Tuesday. The book closed, the light switched to its dim night setting, she makes her way back downstairs, and it is here, somewhere between 9:45 and 10, that the shape of the evening genuinely begins to shift. Her husband, if the television is on, might still be watching, and she joins him for a stretch, sitting beside him on the sofa, though rarely watching quite as closely as he does, her attention drifting toward the mending basket sitting nearby, or simply toward the pleasant, undemanding company of sharing a room with someone she has spent years learning to be comfortable with in silence. They might talk a little during a commercial, or during a lull in whatever program has claimed his attention, small updates about the day that had not come up over dinner, a mention of something one of the children had said, a brief complaint about a difficult co-worker that she has heard variations of many times before and still listens to with genuine attention, because that too is part of what a marriage of this era generally required of a wife, and because, beneath the requirement, she generally did care. 10 o'clock, and a husband begins the particular ritual of a man readying himself for bed, considerably shorter and simpler than her own equivalent ritual would prove to be. A final trip to the bathroom, the television or the lamp switched off, a kiss goodnight delivered somewhere between the living room and the stairs, brief and automatic after years of marriage, but not without genuine warmth in it. Good night, he might say. Don't stay up too late, a small piece of advice she generally has no intention of following, and he generally does not expect her to follow, an exchange that has become its own small ritual within the larger ritual of the evening, spoken almost every night in nearly identical form, the way certain phrases in a long marriage eventually stop being sentences and become something closer to a shared piece of music, familiar enough that the specific words barely register anymore, only the warmth underneath them. And then, finally, this particular quiet hour we have spent so long describing actually arrives, the house genuinely emptying of anyone who needs anything further from her, and she is left alone in the kitchen, or moves there specifically because the kitchen, more than any other room in the house, has become her particular territory at this hour, the room where she feels most fully herself. The kettle goes on. The specific quality of silence that only exists once every other member of a household has finally, fully fallen asleep, settles over the house, a silence with texture to it, a silence you can feel pressing gently against your ears if you sit with it long enough. The tea, when it finally steeps to her liking, gets carried to the table, and she settles into her usual chair, the one nearest the window, its vinyl seat cool at first, through the fabric of her robe, before gradually warming to match her body. This is the moment, more than any other in the entire day, where her shoulders actually drop, a physical release she rarely notices happening in the moment, but that anyone watching closely would have seen clearly, the particular way tension leaves a body once it finally understands, on some level below conscious thought, that nothing further will be asked of it tonight. She might reach first for the magazine sitting on the table's edge, its cover slightly curled from having been carried around in her bag earlier in the week, open to wherever her bookmark, usually a folded grocery receipt, happens to sit. The pages make a particular soft sound as she turns them, and she reads slowly, not because the material demands slow reading, but because there is, at this hour, no reason whatsoever to hurry. An article about a new fabric softener claims to leave clothes remarkably soft, a claim she reads with the mild, practiced skepticism of a woman who has fallen for enough advertising promises over the years to no longer take any of them entirely at face value. A recipe for a molded gelatin salad, elaborate and slightly strange to modern eyes, catches her attention, and she considers briefly whether it might work for the church supper coming up in a few weeks, before deciding the ingredients required would stretch this week's grocery budget further than she wants to stretch it, and turning the page. Somewhere around this point, the radio, which has been playing low throughout, shifts to a program she particularly enjoys, a mystery serial perhaps, its familiar theme music drawing her attention away from the magazine entirely for a few minutes, her eyes drifting toward the middle distance as she follows the story purely through sound, voices and sound effects, constructing an entire scene in her imagination with no visual assistance whatsoever, a skill that an entire generation raised on radio possessed almost without realizing it was a skill at all. The detective in tonight's episode has stumbled onto a clue in a dimly lit warehouse, footsteps echoing against a floor she cannot see but can somehow picture perfectly regardless, and she sits with her tea going cold once again, genuinely absorbed, for these particular 15 minutes, in a story that has absolutely nothing to do with her own life. The mending basket comes out once the program ends, or sometimes stays untouched entirely if the evening has taken a different shape. But on this particular night, let us say, she reaches for it, pulling out a shirt of her husband's with a button hanging by a single thread, and threads a needle by holding it up toward the lamp, squinting slightly, a small concession to eyes that are not quite what they were 10 years earlier, though she has not yet admitted this fully to herself. The button gets secured with a few firm stitches, the thread bitten off rather than reaching for scissors that would require getting up, and she moves to the next item in the basket, a pair of her daughter's stockings with a small run that needs catching before it spreads further. Her hands know this work well enough that her mind is free to wander while they do it, and it wanders, on this particular night, toward nothing in particular at first, and then toward her own mother, gone 5 years now, and the specific memory of watching her do exactly this same task, at exactly this same hour, decades earlier, in a kitchen that no longer exists in the same form, the house having been sold and renovated by whoever bought it after her mother passed. She can picture her mother's hands with a clarity that surprises her, the particular way she held a needle, the small callus on her middle finger from years of exactly this work, and for a moment the two images overlay each other, her own hands and her mother's hands, doing the same task across a gap of time that suddenly feels much smaller than 30 years. This is not a sad thought exactly, though it carries a certain weight to it, the particular ache of missing someone that has softened, over the years since the loss, into something closer to tenderness than grief. She finishes the stocking, sets it aside with the other completed repairs, and glances at the kitchen clock, surprised, as she often is at this stage of the evening, at how much time has actually passed without her quite noticing it slip by. 11:15, later than she meant to still be sitting here, and also, somehow, not late enough, the evening's small pleasures never quite lasting as long as she would like them to. She sets the mending basket aside and makes her way to the small vanity table tucked into the corner of the bedroom, a modest piece of furniture with a round mirror and a single drawer where the essentials of the nightly ritual live, the jar of cold cream, a comb, a small dish for pins, a bottle of hand lotion she applies almost as an afterthought at the very end. The bedroom itself is quiet, lit only by the single lamp on the vanity, her husband's breathing steady and even from the bed a few feet away, deep enough now that she knows from long experience nothing short of a genuine emergency would wake him. She sits, and the face in the mirror looks back at her with the particular honesty that only this hour and this lighting ever really allow. The lipstick, reapplied that afternoon before an errand to the market, has mostly worn away by now, just a faint stain remaining at the corners of her mouth. She works the cold cream over her face in slow, practiced circles, feeling the last of the day's careful presentation dissolve under her own fingers, and beneath it, gradually, her actual face emerges, a face she rarely examines this closely at any other point in the day, when mirrors are consulted quickly and functionally rather than lingered over. a small line beginning to form between her eyebrows from years of concentration or worry or both. The particular softness that has settled at her jaw since her last child was born, not unwelcome exactly, simply new, a body's honest record of what it has been through. She does not dwell on any of this unhappily. If anything, there is something close to acceptance in the way she studies her own reflection at this hour, an acceptance that would have felt considerably harder to access at 9 in the morning, in front of a mirror consulted anxiously before facing the day's judgments. At 11:30 at night, with nobody watching and nothing left to prove, her own face simply is what it is, and there is a kind of peace in that, however small. The hairpins come out next, set into their small dish one by one, the particular metallic click of each one landing against the others building into a small familiar percussion as her hair gradually loosens and falls. She picks up the brush and works through it slowly, 20 strokes counted out of habit, rather than any real belief in the specific number's importance, a piece of advice absorbed so long ago from some magazine or some older relative that its origin has been entirely forgotten, only the practice itself remaining. Her hair, dark, or perhaps beginning to show the first threads of grey depending on which particular version of this woman we are picturing tonight, falls loose around her shoulders, and she catches, for just a moment, a glimpse of someone considerably younger looking back at her, the specific configuration of loose hair and bare face, somehow erasing a decade in the mirror's soft lamplight. If tomorrow requires a particular hairstyle, church, a visit from relatives, some occasion demanding more than the ordinary effort, she winds sections into pin curls now, securing each with a small metal clip, working methodically around her head until the whole arrangement is complete, a slightly uncomfortable architecture she will sleep in regardless, having long since adapted to falling asleep despite it. A scarf, folded into a triangle and tied at the nape of her neck, holds the whole construction in place through the night, protecting both the curls and the pillowcase from whatever product she has worked through her hair to help the curls hold their shape until morning. The final steps happen quickly now, tiredness beginning to properly assert itself. Night cream worked into her face and hands and elbows, the particular scent of it, floral and slightly medicinal, as familiar to her by now as her own breathing. Teeth brushed, the water from the bathroom tap running cold enough to fully wake her for a moment, before the tiredness reasserts itself even more strongly the second she stops moving. She switches off the vanity lamp, and the room drops into a darkness broken only by whatever moonlight or streetlight finds its way through the gap in the curtains, and she slips beneath the covers beside her husband, who shifts slightly at the disturbance without waking, his arm finding its way, from long habit rather than any conscious decision, across toward her side of the bed. She lies there for a few minutes before sleep actually claims her, and these minutes, brief as they are, constitute their own small final chapter of the evening, a last quiet stretch of time in which absolutely nothing is required of her at all, not even the small effort of holding a needle or turning a page. She listens to her husband's breathing, to the particular tick of the house settling around her, to, if it is summer, the crickets outside, or, if it is winter, the specific hush that only ever accompanies genuinely cold, genuinely still nights. Her mind moves loosely across the day just finished, and the day about to begin, without any real urgency attached to either, thoughts arriving and dissolving with none of the sharp, demanding quality they carry during daylight hours. Tomorrow the alarm will ring at 5:30 or 6, and the whole cycle will begin again. The percolator, the table set just so, the children roused and fed and sent off, the particular choreography of a day built almost entirely around the needs of others. But that is tomorrow's concern, still hours away, and right now, in this specific moment, in this specific bed, in this specific house that she has spent years turning into a home through 1,000 small daily acts nobody will ever fully catalogue or credit, there is only this, the dark, the quiet, the weight of a full day finally fully released, and sleep arriving now the way it always eventually does, gently, without announcement, closing the day the same soft way it closes every day, one breath at a time, until there is nothing left but rest. Now, I want to widen the frame a little, because everything we have described so far assumes a fairly particular kind of household, a suburban home with a husband working a regular daytime job, children of school age, a kitchen equipped with the conveniences that had, by this point in the decade, become standard in a great many American homes. But the country in this era was hardly uniform, and the shape of this same quiet evening hour shifted considerably depending on where exactly a woman happened to be living it. Consider for a moment a farm wife, her evening governed by an entirely different set of demands than her suburban counterpart. The animals needed tending regardless of the hour, chickens shut safely into their coop against whatever predators the night might bring, a cow perhaps needing a final check before the household settled in. Her kitchen, likely larger and more central to the whole operation of the farmhouse than a suburban kitchen tended to be, might still hold the warmth of a wood-burning stove that had cooked the family's supper and would need banking down for the night, coals raked and covered to hold their heat until the considerably earlier morning a farm household generally required, sometimes 4 or 4:30 rather than the relatively luxurious 5:30 of the suburban schedule. Her evening hour, when it came, might be shorter, claimed only after chores that had no suburban equivalent were fully finished, but it was, if anything, even more fiercely protected once it finally arrived, precisely because it had been earned through a day that started earlier and demanded more of her body than most town or city schedules did. Or consider a woman in one of the growing number of apartment buildings filling out American cities in these years, her evening hour unfolding in a considerably smaller kitchen, walls thin enough that she could sometimes hear a neighboring family's own evening winding down, a radio through the wall, footsteps on the floor above. No yard to look out on, no porch to retreat to in summer, her view instead a fire escape, or a narrow air shaft, or if she was fortunate, a window that actually faced the street, where she could watch the particular nighttime rhythm of a city continuing well past the hour her own small household had gone quiet, a streetcar passing at intervals, a couple walking home from somewhere, laughing about something she would never know the context of. Her isolation, in some ways, was less complete than the suburban wife's, surrounded as she was by other lives happening in close proximity on every side, and yet in other ways it might have felt more acute, all that closeness somehow not translating into any particular connection, thin walls separating her from neighbors she might recognize in the hallway but rarely knew with any real intimacy. Regional differences mattered too, in ways both large and small. A woman in the rural South might spend her summer evening hour on a porch that stayed occupied by the whole family until considerably later than a northern household would keep, the heat simply too oppressive to retreat indoors before it had properly broken. Sweet tea replacing the tea or coffee more common further north, the particular chorus of insects and frogs entirely different from what a woman in New England or the upper Midwest would recognize as the sound of a summer night. A woman in the mountain west might contend with evenings that turned genuinely cold even in July, once the sun had fully set, requiring a shawl pulled close even in the height of summer. A woman near the coast, in New England or the Pacific Northwest, might have her evening hour shaped by the particular sound of a foghorn somewhere in the distance, or the specific quality of salt air drifting through a cracked window, entirely different sensory textures than her counterpart 1,000 miles inland would ever encounter. The point of walking through all these variations, I think, is not simply to catalogue difference for its own sake, but to notice something underneath all of it that stayed remarkably consistent no matter where in the country a particular woman happened to be living. Whatever her specific circumstances, whatever her kitchen looked like, or her climate demanded, or her particular household required of her, there was, for a genuinely enormous number of women across this decade, some version of this same late evening hour carved out through sheer persistence from a day that offered very little of it freely. The specific rituals varied, the underlying need did not. Let me tell you about a particular object now, one that appears again and again in accounts of this era, and that I find honestly quite moving once you understand its full significance, and that is the hope chest. Many women had received one as a young woman, before marriage even, a wooden chest, often cedar for its particular ability to protect fabric from moths, given by a mother or grandmother, and gradually filled, across the years of courtship and engagement, with items meant for the home she would someday keep, linens, embroidered by her own hand or inherited from relatives, a set of good china, perhaps a single place setting at a time, added as birthday or Christmas gifts across several years, until by the time of her wedding a full set sat ready, still boxed, waiting for a table that did not yet exist. By the time we find her in this particular decade, married for years, that hope chest often still sat at the foot of the bed or in a closet, its original purpose long since fulfilled, but its contents rarely disturbed except for the truly special occasions the good china was reserved for: Christmas dinner, a daughter's christening, the rare visit from her husband's employer that called for a table set with real ceremony rather than the everyday dishes that saw use 3 times a day, every day, without any particular fanfare at all. On an ordinary Tuesday night, that china sat in the china cabinet, untouched, and there was something in knowing it was there, this small store of formality and beauty, waiting patiently for the occasions that would call it into use, that mattered to her in a way that is difficult to fully articulate. It was proof, in a sense, that her life contained room for more than the merely functional. That beauty had been planned for, saved for, considered worth the expense and the care, even in a household where every other dollar was tracked carefully in a ledger by lamplight. This was also, worth remembering, a decade of genuinely rapid change in the American kitchen itself, and it is worth understanding the broader context a little, because the specific tools available to her at 11 o'clock at night were themselves quite new, historically speaking, even if she had already come to take them entirely for granted. The post-war years had brought an explosion of household appliances onto the market, refrigerators replacing iceboxes in home after home, electric mixers and toasters, and by the middle of the decade, an early wave of dishwashers beginning to appear in the more affluent households, though these remained, for most families, an aspiration rather than a reality for a good while yet. Advertisements in the very magazine she read at this quiet hour promised, with tremendous confidence, that each new gadget would liberate her from drudgery, would give her back hours of her day to spend however she pleased. The reality, as historians who study this period have noted more than once, proved considerably more complicated than the advertisements suggested. Labor-saving devices did reduce the raw physical effort certain tasks required, certainly an electric mixer sparing her arm the work of beating batter by hand for several minutes at a stretch, but standards for what counted as a properly run household rose right alongside the new conveniences, so that a woman with a washing machine was now expected to produce laundry immaculately clean and pressed, rather than merely clean. A woman with a refrigerator was expected to plan more elaborate meals requiring more varied ingredients kept properly fresh, and the net effect, across the decade as a whole, was that the actual hours spent on housework changed remarkably little for a great many women, even as the specific tasks filling those hours shifted considerably. She had a machine to wash the clothes now. She did not particularly have more free time as a result, because the definition of a well-kept home had simply expanded to fill whatever room the new machine had opened up. I mention this not to diminish the very real comfort these new tools did provide. A washing machine is genuinely, meaningfully easier on the body than a washboard and a bucket, but to add a little honest complexity to a story that could otherwise slide too easily into a simple narrative of progress steadily improving her daily life across the decade. Progress happened. It simply did not happen in quite the straightforward, liberating way the advertisements in her evening magazine liked to suggest. Tupperware parties belong to this same story of the era's changing domestic landscape, and they deserve their own brief mention because they represent one of the few socially sanctioned avenues through which a woman of this decade might earn a small independent income, or at least a modest supplement to the household budget, entirely on her own initiative. A woman might host a party in her own living room, inviting neighbors and friends over for coffee and dessert, at which a representative, sometimes herself if she had taken on the role of a dealer, would demonstrate the particular virtues of the plastic containers with their distinctive burping seal, a small pop of air that customers found, by all accounts, genuinely satisfying to hear and to feel beneath their fingers. These parties, dismissed sometimes in later decades as a trivial suburban curiosity, actually represented something quietly significant, a network of women building their own small commercial enterprise entirely outside the world of formal employment their husbands occupied, earning commissions, developing genuine sales skill, and doing it all within a framework that never openly challenged the era's assumptions about a woman's proper place, because it happened, after all, in someone's living room, over coffee, framed as a social gathering rather than a business meeting, even though for many of the women involved it functioned as exactly that. Let me walk you through a second evening now, a different night entirely, in a different season, because I think there is something valuable in seeing how differently this same underlying ritual could unfold depending on the particular circumstances of a particular week. This time it is January, and the house we are picturing sits somewhere in the upper Midwest, where winter arrives with real seriousness and stays for months rather than weeks. Snow has been falling on and off for 3 days, and the yard outside the kitchen window is buried under nearly a foot of it, unbroken except for the single set of footprints her husband made walking to the car that morning, already half filled in again by the afternoon's continued light snow. The house is warm, the furnace working steadily in the basement, its low mechanical hum a constant, comforting presence throughout the evening, occasionally interrupted by the louder clank of the system cycling on after a period of rest. Dinner tonight was something warm and substantial, a beef stew that had simmered most of the afternoon, filling the house with a smell that lingered pleasantly into the evening hours even after the dishes were cleared. The children, cooped up indoors most of the day by the weather, had been particularly restless, and getting them settled for bed took considerably longer than usual. Both of them wound up on an energy that seemed to have nowhere else to go given the snow outside. By the time she finally has them tucked in, read to, and genuinely asleep rather than merely quiet, it is closer to 10:30 than her usual 10 o'clock, and she comes back downstairs feeling the particular fatigue that comes from a day spent managing not just the ordinary tasks, but the extra friction of restless, housebound children on top of them. Her husband, a construction worker whose outdoor job has been considerably slowed by the weather this week, meaning less pay in this particular paycheck, a worry she has been turning over quietly in her mind without mentioning it to him directly, because there is nothing to be done about it tonight regardless, is already in bed by the time she reaches the kitchen. The house is properly quiet now, the specific hush of a winter night pressing against the windows, snow still falling steadily enough outside that she can see it in the small cone of light thrown by the street lamp at the corner, flakes drifting down in an unhurried, almost lazy pattern against the dark sky. She does not reach for tea tonight, not right away. Instead she pours a small glass of the sherry her mother-in-law had given the family for Christmas, a bottle that has sat mostly untouched in the cabinet since, and carries it to the table along with the household ledger, because the worry about this week's reduced pay has been sitting with her all evening, and she would rather face it directly than let it simply hum along in the back of her mind unresolved. The numbers, when she works through them, prove less alarming than her imagination had built them up to be over the course of the day, the family's small savings envelope able to absorb a slow week without any real damage, and she feels the specific relief of a worry examined honestly and found smaller than feared, closes the ledger, and allows herself, finally, to relax into the evening properly. The sherry, sipped slowly, warms her in a way the kitchen's ordinary heat does not quite manage on a night this cold, and she sits for a while simply looking at the snow continuing to fall outside the window, her mind drifting without any particular direction, the specific pleasant blankness that a hard day, once it has finally ended, sometimes grants as its reward. She thinks, briefly, about her sister down in Georgia, who has written recently to describe a Christmas with barely a hint of cold weather at all, and tries, without much success, to imagine what it might feel like to spend a whole winter without ever seeing snow like this, decides she cannot properly picture it, and lets the thought go. Her knitting sits nearby, a sweater intended for her husband, dark green wool that she had chosen specifically because she remembered him admiring a similar color on a co-worker's jacket some months back, and she picks it up now, working several rows in the particular comfortable silence that only a genuinely cold, genuinely still winter night seems to produce. The needles click softly against each other, a small steady rhythm beneath the deeper silence of the sleeping house, and outside the snow keeps falling, softening every sound the world might otherwise be making, so that even the distant bark of a neighbor's dog reaches her muffled and gentle, as though the whole night has been wrapped in the same soft batting currently building up on every rooftop and fence post along her street. By midnight she has finished a full section of the sweater's back panel, farther than she had expected to get tonight, and she sets the knitting aside with a small satisfaction, glancing once more out the window before making her way upstairs. The world outside has gone entirely white and entirely silent. No cars passing at this hour on a night like this, no sound at all beyond the faint hiss of snow continuing to fall, and she stands at the window a moment longer than she strictly needs to, simply looking, before finally turning off the kitchen light and climbing the stairs toward bed, toward her sleeping husband and her sleeping children, and the particular, hard-won piece of a house that has once again made it safely through to the end of another difficult, ordinary day. I share this second evening alongside the first, not because the details differ so dramatically, though they do, the sherry instead of tea, the ledger consulted with real worry rather than casual habit, the snow instead of crickets, but because I want you to notice how much stays the same underneath all of that surface variation, the quiet arriving only once everyone else has gone to sleep, the specific relief of worry examined and set down, the handwork picked up not from obligation but from genuine pleasure in it, the window consulted, again and again, as though the night outside has something to offer her that the lit kitchen cannot quite provide on its own. Whatever her particular circumstances, whatever season or house or marriage she happened to be living inside, this fundamental architecture of the evening held, night after night, across a whole generation of women whose individual stories we will mostly never know, but whose collective rhythm, I think, we can still feel the shape of, even now 70 years removed from any of it. It is worth asking, before we drift any further into sleep ourselves, what eventually happened to this particular ritual, this specific quiet hour that so many women across this decade built for themselves out of almost nothing, because it did not last forever, not in the exact form we have been describing. The decade that followed brought changes that reshaped American domestic life considerably, more women entering the workforce in growing numbers, television eventually claiming a larger share of the evening than radio and magazines ever had, the whole rhythm of family life gradually shifting in ways too large and too gradual to trace cleanly to any single cause. The porches emptied out first, oddly enough, air conditioning arriving in home after home through the following decades and removing the practical necessity that had once sent whole families outside on summer evenings to escape the heat trapped indoors. Once the living room stayed cool on its own, there was less reason to sit outside, and the particular neighborly closeness that porch season had fostered, conversations conducted across low fences on hot summer nights, faded along with it, not disappearing entirely but thinning considerably from what it had once been. The party telephone lines disappeared too, replaced eventually by private lines for every household, a genuine convenience that nonetheless quietly dissolved one more thread of the small informal social network that had connected women along a shared street or a shared rural route. Letter writing declined gradually, and then, with the arrival of the telephone as a genuinely affordable long-distance option, and eventually, decades further on, the arrival of the internet, essentially disappeared as a primary means of staying connected to distant family. The fountain pen and the folded stationery, replaced first by a phone call and then by something even faster and even less permanent. The recipe boxes mostly survive still, tucked into drawers in the homes of daughters and granddaughters who inherited them, though they are consulted now, if at all, alongside a phone that can summon 1,000 recipes in an instant, the specific patient pleasure of flipping through handwritten cards by lamplight, a pleasure that fewer and fewer people ever discover for themselves. I do not say any of this with any particular judgment attached to it. Every one of these changes brought real, genuine benefits alongside whatever it quietly displaced, and I would not for a moment suggest that today's conveniences represent some kind of loss we ought to mourn outright. But I do think it is worth noticing, gently, without any heavy conclusion attached, that something particular about this specific evening hour, this specific way of claiming a small private territory out of an otherwise fully occupied day, has grown considerably rarer than it once was. We fill our own quiet hours differently now, scrolling rather than reading a physical magazine, texting rather than writing a letter that takes 3 nights to complete, and there is nothing wrong with any of that. But there was something in the older version, the slower version, that I find myself, even now, genuinely admiring. Many of the women who lived through exactly the evenings we have spent this whole video describing are gone now, or very elderly, the youngest of them well into their 80s, the specific texture of their particular Tuesday nights known now mostly through the stories they told their own daughters, or through the diaries and letters that happened to survive, tucked into boxes in attics, occasionally rediscovered and read decades later by a granddaughter curious about a grandmother she barely remembers, or never knew at all. Their daughters, the women who grew up watching this particular evening ritual unfold night after night from the other side of it, from the perspective of the child being tucked in rather than the mother doing the tucking, often describe it now with a very particular kind of tenderness, a memory of a mother who seemed, in that specific late hour glimpsed occasionally from the top of the stairs on a night's sleep, would not quite come, softer somehow, more herself than she appeared at any other point in the day. I think that is in the end the truest thing this whole story has to offer, not a lesson about progress, or about how much harder or easier life has become across the decades separating her evenings from ours. Just that image, a mother glimpsed from the stairs, alone in a lamplit kitchen, doing absolutely nothing that anyone would consider remarkable, and somehow in that nothing, being more completely herself than she managed to be at any other hour of her carefully, dutifully managed day. Sometimes, not often, but often enough to be worth mentioning, this quiet hour was shared rather than solitary, and this happened most typically between neighbours who had grown close enough over years of proximity that a light still burning in a kitchen window at 11 at night was less an oddity than an invitation. She might notice, glancing out her own window, that the house 2 doors down still had its kitchen light on, and on a night when her own thoughts felt a little heavier than usual, or simply on a night when company sounded appealing rather than solitude, she might slip on a coat over her robe and walk the short distance across 2 yards, tapping softly on the back door rather than the front. A code among women of this particular kind of friendship, that the back door meant something informal, something that did not require getting properly dressed or straightening up the good room for a visitor. The 2 of them would sit together then, voices kept low out of habit, even though both households were, by this hour, thoroughly asleep. Coffee or tea shared across a kitchen table that was not her own, but felt, after years of exactly this kind of occasional late visit, almost as familiar. These conversations moved differently than daytime conversations did, less concerned with the practical business of borrowing a cup of sugar or coordinating a carpool, and more likely to drift into the genuinely personal, a worry about a husband's health, a hope for a daughter's upcoming wedding, an old grief neither of them usually mentioned in daylight, but that seemed, somehow, more bearable to speak of at this particular hour, in this particular low light, with nobody else awake to overhear it. She would walk home an hour or so later than she had intended, the night considerably colder now than when she had left, and climb into bed feeling, in a way she could not always articulate, lighter than she had felt in days, the specific relief of having been genuinely heard by someone who understood, without needing much explanation, exactly what she meant. There were other nights, harder ones, when this quiet hour got interrupted or reshaped entirely by a child's illness, a fever that had crept up over the course of the evening, and these nights looked nothing like the peaceful version we have spent most of this story describing. She might spend the whole of what would ordinarily have been her own private hour instead sitting at the edge of a child's bed, a cool cloth pressed to a hot forehead, the household supply of aspirin and the little glass thermometer laid out on the nightstand, checked and rechecked at intervals that felt considerably longer than the clock actually confirmed them to be. There was no tea on these nights, no magazine, no radio program followed with any real attention, just the low murmur of a worried mother's voice, humming something soft and half-remembered, an old lullaby her own mother had likely sung to her decades earlier, the words not quite complete anymore but the melody intact, carrying her through hour after hour of watching a small chest rise and fall a little too quickly, waiting for a fever to break. These nights, difficult as they were, tended to end, eventually, in their own particular kind of relief, the fever finally breaking somewhere in the deep hours of the night, the child's forehead cooling under her palm, breathing evening back out into its normal rhythm, and she would sit a little longer even after the crisis had clearly passed, simply watching, simply grateful, before finally allowing her own exhausted body to seek out whatever few hours of sleep remained before the next day, illness or not, would insist on beginning again regardless. And there were nights, too, when her private hour was spent waiting rather than resting, her husband out later than expected, a work function running long, or simply an evening with the other men from his shop that had stretched past the hour he usually returned. These waiting hours carried their own particular texture, distinct from the peaceful solitude of an ordinary evening, a low current of worry running beneath whatever activity she used to fill the time, glancing more frequently than usual toward the window, toward the sound of a car engine that might or might not be his coming up the street. Most of these nights resolved themselves simply and without incident, the sound of his key finally in the lock somewhere around midnight, an explanation offered, sometimes sheepishly, about how the time had simply gotten away from everyone, and whatever worry had been building in her chest would release all at once, replaced by the specific relief of a husband home safe, followed by bed and sleep, and the whole matter mostly forgotten by morning. On certain nights, without any particular trigger she could identify, her mind would drift backward toward courtship, toward the specific version of herself that existed before any of this, before the husband asleep upstairs and the children down the hall, and the whole elaborate architecture of household and routine that now defined her days so completely. She might find herself thinking of a particular dance, the one where she had first properly noticed him, not as the older brother of a school friend she had known peripherally for years, but as someone entirely different, someone whose attention, once she had it, felt like something worth rearranging her whole evening around. She remembered the dress she had worn, pale blue, a color she had not owned anything in for years now, practical dark colors having gradually replaced the brighter wardrobe of her unmarried years. She remembered, with a clarity that surprised her, the specific song playing when he had finally asked her to dance, and found herself humming a few bars of it now, quietly, at her own kitchen table. Decades later, the melody still perfectly intact, even though she could not have told you, if asked directly, what year that dance had actually taken place. The wedding itself, when her mind wandered that far, tended to arrive not as a single clear memory, but as a collection of small fragments, the particular weight of her mother's veil pinned into her hair, the sound of her own heels on the church's stone floor, a moment just before walking down the aisle when she had genuinely wondered, for the space of perhaps 3 full seconds, whether she was making the right decision at all, a doubt so fleeting it had dissolved before she had even finished forming it into a proper thought, and that she had never once mentioned to anyone in all the years since, not even to him. These were not unhappy memories to revisit. If anything, sitting with them at this particular hour, in this particular kitchen, carried a kind of gentle warmth, evidence that the life she was currently living, however far removed it might feel from that nervous, hopeful young woman in the pale blue dress, had grown directly out of a choice she still, all these years later, felt good about having made. I want to spend a little more time now simply on the sound of the house itself, because I think, at this hour of the night, this particular hour we have been keeping her company through, sound matters more than almost anything else, more than sight, more even than the specific tasks filling her hands. A house at rest makes a whole vocabulary of small sounds that a house in use never quite reveals, sounds too quiet to register over the daytime clatter of footsteps and dishes and children's voices, sounds that only emerge once everything louder has finally gone silent. The particular creak of a house settling as the temperature drops through the evening, wood contracting fractionally in a pattern so consistent that a woman who has lived in the same house for years could probably tell you the approximate hour, purely from which specific creak she had just heard. The third stair, always around 10:30, the window frame in the back bedroom sometime after 11, the refrigerator's cycle, humming to life and falling silent again at intervals that had become, over years of living alongside it, almost a form of company in themselves, a mechanical presence marking time the way a grandfather clock might in a grander house. The particular quality of silence itself, which is never actually silent if you listen closely enough, always some faint underlying hum of electricity moving through wires, or wind finding some small gap around a window frame, or, in older houses, the pipes ticking faintly as water cooled somewhere in the walls after the last use of the evening. Outside, depending on the season, a whole additional layer of sound existed, the crickets of summer building to a steady drone that somehow managed to feel both loud and soothing at once, or the particular hush of winter snow that seemed to swallow sound rather than carry it, muffling even the occasional passing car, until it was little more than a soft whoosh heard and gone before she had fully registered it. A dog, somewhere on the street, barking twice at some disturbance only it could perceive, and then falling silent again. An owl, on the nights her particular neighborhood happened to host one, calling from a tree a few yards over, a sound that had startled her badly the first time she heard it years ago, and that she had grown, over time, to find rather comforting, a small piece of genuine wilderness persisting right alongside the manicured order of her suburban street. She had, over years of sitting alone in this particular kitchen at this particular hour, become something of an expert in this vocabulary of small sounds, able to distinguish, without needing to look up from her mending, the difference between her husband merely shifting in his sleep upstairs and her husband actually getting up, between the wind simply moving through the trees and the wind carrying the first hints of a storm building somewhere beyond the edge of town. This kind of knowledge never gets written down anywhere, never appears in any history book's account of the decade, and yet it represents its own genuine expertise, built patiently over years of exactly this kind of quiet nightly attention, a fluency in her own particular corner of the world that belonged to her, and to her alone, more completely than almost anything else in her carefully managed, dutifully shared life. There is a particular satisfaction, distinct from anything else this hour offered her, in the night a handmade project finally reached completion, whether it was the green wool sweater worked steadily across an entire winter's worth of quiet evenings, or a quilt pieced together over the better part of a year, or something smaller, a single embroidered pillowcase finished in a handful of sittings, the final stitch tied off, the project held up and examined under the lamp's warm light, turned over once or twice to check the back of the work as carefully as the front, because a woman who has spent this much careful attention on something wants to know that the care shows all the way through, not merely on the side meant for display. She might not give the finished piece away immediately. Often it sat for a while, folded on a shelf or draped over the back of a chair, simply admired in passing over the following days, before eventually finding its way to whoever it had been intended for, wrapped for a birthday, or set quietly on a daughter's bed without any particular occasion at all, just because the daughter had admired the pattern weeks earlier and she had remembered. The particular joy of giving something made entirely by hand across dozens of these quiet evening hours carried a weight that a store-bought gift, however nice, simply could not match, because the recipient was receiving not merely an object, but a measurable quantity of her actual time, her actual attention, hour after hour of an evening she could have spent any number of other ways, chosen instead, night after night, to spend on them. The turning of the seasons brought its own quiet markers into this late evening hour too, small signs she had learned, over years of living in the same house, to notice and to welcome. The first evening in spring warm enough to leave a window cracked without a fire going, the particular smell of thawing earth and new growth drifting in, different from any other smell of the year, carrying with it an almost physical sense of relief after months of a closed-up, heated house. She might spend part of that particular evening simply planning, mentally, the spring cleaning that would need doing over the coming weeks, curtains taken down and washed, windows scrubbed inside and out, rugs carried outside and beaten clean, a whole seasonal ritual that required real physical labor, but that she nonetheless anticipated with something close to genuine pleasure. The specific satisfaction of a house thoroughly refreshed after a long winter's accumulation of closed-in stolness. Autumn brought a different set of markers. The canning season's final jars sealed and shelved sometime in September, the garden's last tomatoes brought in before the first frost could claim them, and with these small closings came the settling in of the household for the colder months ahead, storm windows fitted over the summer screens, the furnace tested and readied, extra blankets brought down from wherever they had spent the summer stored away. Her evening hour in these transitional weeks often carried a particular reflective quality, the whole year's rhythm visible to her in a way it was not during the deeper, more settled stretches of summer or winter, and she would sometimes find herself, on these particular nights, thinking not just about the day just finished, but about the year as a whole, where it had gone, what had changed, what remained the same, in the gentle, unhurried way that only this specific hour, this specific solitude, ever seemed to invite. We have spent a great deal of time together now, walking through this particular hour of this particular life, and I think it is time to let her rest, and to let you rest alongside her, because that has always been, underneath everything else, the actual purpose of this quiet evening ritual we have spent so long describing. Not productivity, not accomplishment, though plenty of small accomplishments happened within it. A sweater finished, a letter sent, a worry examined and set gently down. Simply rest, claimed in whatever small window a full life allowed for it, night after night, across years that eventually became a whole life lived, largely in service of others, but never entirely, never completely, because this hour, this particular hour, remained hers, and hers alone, however small it might have looked from the outside. A good number of women in this decade also carried, into this quiet evening hour, some measure of responsibility for an aging parent, a mother or father grown too frail to fully manage alone, but not yet requiring the kind of full-time care that would mean leaving their own home entirely, an arrangement that fell, as so much of this era's caregiving did, almost automatically onto the daughter rather than the son, regardless of which child lived closer or had more practical capacity for it. Her own mother, let us say, lived 2 streets over in this particular telling, in the same small house she had lived in for 30 years, increasingly unsteady on her feet, increasingly forgetful about small things, like whether she had already taken her evening medication or eaten her dinner at all. Part of this late hour, on certain nights, was spent not in her own kitchen, but walking the 2 streets over to check in, a habit that had started as an occasional visit and had gradually become, without either of them quite deciding it should, a nightly one. She would let herself in with her own key, find her mother usually already in bed or settling toward it, and sit with her for 10 or 15 minutes, checking that the stove had been properly turned off, that the medication bottle showed the right number of pills missing for the day, small quiet verifications performed with as much gentleness as she could manage, careful never to let her mother feel watched or managed rather than simply visited. Her mother, for her part, seemed to understand exactly what was happening beneath the surface of these visits, and mostly allowed it with a kind of weary grace, the particular reversal of roles between a mother and a daughter that comes for so many families eventually, the one who once did all the caretaking gradually becoming the one who needs it, and the daughter who once needed everything gradually becoming the one who provides it. These visits added real time and real weight to an evening that was already, by any reasonable measure, quite full, and yet she rarely resented them, understanding without needing to articulate it that this particular season of caring for her mother, however tiring, was also finite in a way she was not yet ready to fully sit with, and that some part of her wanted these evening visits precisely because of how limited a number of them actually remained. Church and community life filled certain evenings too, beyond the ordinary Sunday service, committee meetings for the Altar Guild or the Missionary Society, a rotating schedule of hosting duties for whichever group she happened to belong to, and on the nights these meetings fell in her own home, the late evening hour looked entirely different, extending backward to absorb the hours of preparation, coffee cups and small sandwiches arranged with real care, the good tablecloth brought out for company that was, in truth, mostly just her neighbours and friends from the congregation, women she saw at the market or across the fence on any ordinary week, but who nonetheless warranted, in this particular context, the full formal treatment her mother had taught her a proper hostess always provided. These meetings ran late sometimes, discussion of the upcoming rummage sale or the mission barrel for a struggling parish overseas stretching past 10, and once the last guest had finally gathered her coat and departed with warm thanks and a promise to see everyone at church Sunday, the dishes still needed washing, the good china dried by hand and returned carefully to its cabinet, before her own quiet hour, considerably shortened on nights like this one, could finally properly begin. There is a particular list of small specific pleasures that recur across so many accounts of this era's evening hours, small enough individually that none of them would seem worth mentioning on their own, and yet collectively, I think, they tell you something true about what actually sustained a woman through a day this demanding. The particular satisfaction of a well-organized linen closet, sheets folded into precise matching thirds and stacked by size, a small private order achieved in one corner of a life that often felt, in its larger shape, considerably less orderly than she might have liked. The pleasure of a first sip of tea, still slightly too hot, the specific moment before it cools enough to drink properly, when the steam still rises visibly off the surface and the whole cup radiates a warmth she can feel against her face before she even brings it to her lips. The quiet triumph of a recipe attempted for the first time and genuinely succeeding, a cake that rose properly, a sauce that did not break, small culinary victories that meant, in a life with relatively few opportunities for measurable success, a genuine accomplishment worth feeling proud of, even if the only witness to that pride was herself, alone, in a kitchen at 11 at night, looking at the empty plate where the successful dish had sat only an hour earlier. There was pleasure too, simply in stillness itself, a pleasure our current culture has grown somewhat suspicious of, treating rest as something that must be earned through demonstrable productivity, or optimized into something measurable and improvable, or filled, if it must happen at all, with some form of entertainment rather than simply experienced on its own terms. She did not need her stillness to be productive. She did not need it to serve any larger purpose beyond the simple, sufficient fact of existing quietly for an hour after a day spent existing loudly, usefully, in service of everyone around her. This, more than almost anything else we have discussed tonight, might be the single quality of her particular era worth genuinely envying. Not the etiquette, not the clearly defined gender roles, not the absence of modern conveniences, but this specific, uncomplicated permission she granted herself, night after night, to simply sit and let the tea go cold, and want nothing further from the hour at all. There is one more object worth mentioning before we let her rest, and that is the family Bible, a large, heavy volume that sat, in most households of this decade, on a shelf in the front room or sometimes in the bedroom itself, its front pages given over not to scripture but to a careful handwritten record of the family itself, births and marriages and deaths recorded in ink across several generations of increasingly unfamiliar handwriting. She might pull it down on certain nights, not often, but on the particular evenings when a letter from a relative had mentioned some family history she wanted to check, or simply when the mood struck her to trace her fingers down that familiar column of names and dates. Her own children's births sat there in her own hand, the specific date and hour recorded with a precision she had felt, at the time, was somehow important to get exactly right. Above that, her own birth, recorded in her mother's hand, and above that, names reaching back far enough that she had never known the people they belonged to, great-grandparents, and further still, names that existed for her only as ink on a page, and yet that she felt, turning to that page at this particular hour, some genuine connection to, a thread reaching backward through the family, in a way that made her own current position in it, wife, mother, keeper of this exact same book, for whatever generation came after her, feel both smaller and somehow more significant at once. The specific physical sensation of her robe deserves a mention too, small as it might seem, because these evening hours were lived almost entirely within its particular fabric, a fabric she had worn so many hundreds of nights that its texture had become almost a part of her own skin. Quilted cotton, usually in a small floral print that had faded slightly over the years of washing, the sash tied loosely at her waist, the sleeves worn thin at the elbows from resting against the kitchen table night after night. Underneath it, a cotton nightgown, plain and practical rather than anything approaching glamorous, its hem brushing just above her ankles, the fabric soft from years of wear in a way that no amount of expensive new fabric could quite replicate. There was something in the specific comfort of these particular garments, chosen for exactly this hour and no other, that mattered more to her than she might have admitted if asked directly. The day's clothing, whatever dress or skirt she had worn to face the world, was structured, fitted, a costume in its own small way. The robe was simply hers, shapeless and soft and asking nothing of her at all. The medicine cabinet in the bathroom held its own quiet late-night rituals too, particularly in households with young children prone to the ordinary small illnesses of childhood. A cough that flared up worse at night, a stomach upset that struck without warning an hour after bedtime. She kept it organized with real care, iodine and gauze for scraped knees, a bottle of the pink stomach remedy every household of this era seemed to keep on hand, a jar of mentholated rub for chest colds that she would work gently into a feverish child's skin at 11 at night, the sharp, clean smell of it filling the small bedroom and somehow, reliably, easing a cough enough to let both mother and child finally get some rest. She trusted this cabinet the way she trusted very little else in her life to actually be under her control, its contents inventoried mentally on a rotation she rarely needed to consciously think through, a small fortress of preparedness assembled specifically against the particular unpredictability of raising young children through the ordinary hazards of an ordinary childhood. Her husband, whatever specific version of him we are picturing tonight, deserves a slightly fuller portrait before we let this particular evening close, because it would be too simple to leave him as merely a sleeping presence in the next room, a source of the occasional snore and the occasional good-night kiss, and very little else. He was in most of these households a man shaped by his own particular set of pressures, a job that demanded long hours and rarely offered much acknowledgement beyond a paycheck, a culture that told him providing for his family financially was very nearly the whole of his responsibility to them, leaving him in a great many cases considerably less practiced than his wife at the specific emotional labor of a household, less attuned to a child's particular worry, less likely to notice when something in the home's quiet rhythm had shifted. This was not universally true. Plenty of these men were genuinely attentive fathers and genuinely present husbands within the limits their era allowed for, but the broad pattern held often enough to be worth naming honestly, and yet within that broad pattern, real tenderness persisted, in ways both large and achingly small. The way he still, after 12 years of marriage, reached for her hand without looking, out of pure habit, whenever they walked somewhere together. The way he remembered, every single year, the specific kind of flower she had carried at their wedding, and brought home a small bouquet of it on their anniversary without her ever needing to remind him. The way he had built, with his own hands over several patient weekends, the small set of shelves in the children's room that held their books and toys, a task nobody had specifically asked of him, undertaken simply because he had noticed the room needed it and had wanted, in his own quieter way, to contribute something lasting to the home she worked so hard, every single day, to maintain. Marriage in this decade asked different things of men and women, unevenly, unfairly in a great many respects, and it is worth being honest about that unevenness rather than romanticizing it away entirely. But within its particular structure, genuine love still found its way through, however imperfectly, however unevenly distributed the labor of expressing it turned out to be. There was, in nearly every one of these households, one particular chair that belonged, by long unspoken agreement, more to her than to anyone else, and it deserves its own small mention here, because so much of this quiet evening hour unfolded within its embrace, not always in the kitchen, sometimes it lived in the front room instead, a rocking chair perhaps, inherited from her own grandmother, its caned seat replaced once or twice over the decades, but its frame, dark wood, worn smooth and slightly shining at the armrests, from generations of hands resting exactly there, entirely original, older than she was, older in fact than her own mother had been when she inherited it in turn. The particular creak of its rockers against the wooden floor, a sound so familiar it had become, over years of use, almost a kind of music, one she could have picked out blindfolded from among a dozen other creaking chairs. She rocked gently while she read, or while she nursed the last of the children through their infant years, a rhythm her body had learnt so completely that she sometimes caught herself rocking slightly, even when sitting in an entirely different, stationary chair elsewhere, the motion having worked its way into her muscles the way a favourite song works its way into memory, present even when the actual source has gone quiet. A particular quilt, too, draped across the back of this chair, or folded at the foot of her bed, carried its own accumulated history worth pausing on, pieced together, in this case by her own grandmother during the hard years of an earlier decade, using whatever fabric scraps a thrifty household happened to have on hand, a genuine patchwork in the truest sense, no two blocks quite matching, some clearly cut from a worn-out dress, others from a flour sack once the printed cotton flour companies had begun using, became fashionable enough to repurpose into clothing and household goods. She could trace, if she looked closely enough on a quiet evening, with nothing better to occupy her attention, the specific garments this quilt had once been, a small triangle of blue gingham that had, she was fairly sure, once been an apron her grandmother wore for years, a strip of soft yellow flannel that might have started life as a baby blanket for one of her own aunts or uncles, the whole object a kind of physical family history stitched together, not with any grand intention, but with simple, practical thrift, transformed over the decades since into something considerably more valuable than the sum of its worn-out original parts, wrapped in this particular quilt on a cold night, or simply looking at it draped across the chair while she worked on some other project entirely. She felt a specific, wordless connection to a whole line of women stretching backward before her, women who had faced considerably harder circumstances than her own relatively comfortable post-war household, women who had made do and made beautiful things out of making do, and passed that particular skill and that particular resilience down through their daughters and granddaughters, largely without ever explicitly naming what they were teaching. She hoped, on the nights she thought about it at all, that some version of this same quiet inheritance might eventually pass to her own daughter, not necessarily this exact quilt, though that too some day, but the underlying instinct itself, the specific capacity to build comfort and beauty out of an ordinary evening's ordinary materials, using nothing more than patience and a needle and an hour nobody else particularly wanted. The last stretch of any given night, once she had finally climbed the stairs and settled into bed beside her sleeping husband, tended to unfold in its own particular slow rhythm, distinct even from the quiet hour that preceded it. Sleep rarely claimed her instantly. She lay for a while in the dark, her body finally horizontal after 16 or more hours upright, feeling the specific, almost luxurious relief of full-body rest after a day that had asked nearly everything of her physically, standing, bending, carrying, reaching, an accumulated fatigue that settled now into the mattress beneath her like sand, finally allowed to sink to the bottom of still water. Her thoughts in these final minutes rarely followed any clear thread, drifting instead in the loose, associative way thoughts tend to move just before sleep finally takes hold, a fragment of the mystery program she had listened to earlier folding into a memory of her mother's kitchen, folding into a vague, half-formed thought about whether she had remembered to set out her husband's clean shirt for tomorrow, which she had, she reminded herself, hours ago, before dinner even, and the reassurance of that small confirmed detail seemed to loosen something further in her chest. One more small worry checked off and released. Outside, whatever the season, the night continued on entirely without her attention now, snow still falling perhaps, or crickets still singing their steady chorus, or simply the ordinary dark quiet of an autumn evening with nothing particular happening in it at all. The whole neighborhood settled now into the same collective stillness her own house had reached an hour or two earlier, somewhere in the deep hours of the night, hours she would never consciously experience. The temperature would drop to its lowest point just before dawn, the way it reliably does on clear nights, and the house would creak and settle a final time as the cold worked its way fully in and the first birds, the earliest risers among them, would begin their tentative pre-dawn calls, hours before the sun itself made any visible appearance, a sound she would never hear, deep in whatever dream had claimed her by then. But that was happening regardless, the world continuing its patient, reliable rhythm whether she was awake to witness it or not. The milk truck would make its rounds, the newspaper would land on the front step with its familiar soft thump, and eventually, inevitably, the alarm clock beside the bed would ring, 5:30 or 6, and she would wake, and reach to silence it before it could wake her husband, and the whole cycle, the coffee, the table set just so, the day's countless small acts of care extended outward toward everyone but herself, would begin again, exactly as it had the day before, and the day before that, stretching backward through years she had stopped bothering to count individually, each one distinguishable from the others mostly by the small, quiet, entirely private hour she had claimed for herself at its very end, night after night, a whole hidden life lived in the margins of a life everyone else believed they fully understood. It is worth remembering, too, that this particular decade's suburban ideal, however dominant it has become in our collective memory of the era, was never the whole picture, and plenty of women lived this same late evening hour inside households shaped by traditions considerably older and considerably more specific than the general post-war American pattern we have been describing. Consider a household a generation or two removed from Italy, where the evening kitchen at this hour might still carry the faint lingering smell of garlic and tomato from a sauce simmered most of the afternoon, a portrait of a grandmother back in a village she herself had never seen hanging on the wall nearby, a rosary kept within easy reach on the windowsill above the sink, worn smooth from decades of use passed down from a mother who had brought it across an ocean in a small trunk that still, itself, sat in the attic upstairs, its leather straps cracked with age. Her late evening hour might include a prayer said quietly in a language her own children were gradually losing fluency in despite her best efforts. A specific ache she felt keenly at this particular hour more than any other, the sense of a whole world of memory and language slipping gradually away with each passing generation, however much she tried to hold on to it through exactly these small nightly rituals, or consider a household shaped by Polish or Ukrainian tradition, where Christmas Eve unfolded according to customs entirely distinct from her neighbours, an extra place set at the table for the unexpected guest, a particular set of foods prepared with real ceremony, and where her late evening hour throughout the rest of the year might include letters written not just to relatives elsewhere in America, but back across an ocean to a homeland increasingly difficult to reach or even communicate with freely, given the political realities of the decade, letters that sometimes went unanswered for months, and that she nonetheless kept writing faithfully because the alternative, simply letting that particular thread go entirely slack, felt like a loss she was not prepared to accept, or a black household, in a decade when the ordinary daily texture of life carried burdens and constraints her white neighbours rarely had to consider at all. Her late evening hour shaped not only by the universal exhaustions of housework and childcare, but by the additional, exhausting vigilance required simply to move safely through a world that remained, in this particular decade, openly and legally hostile to her family's full participation in it, and yet even within, and in some ways precisely because of, everything that made her days harder than her white counterparts' days tended to be, this same late quiet hour held much the same shape and much the same meaning, a small claimed territory of rest and selfhood at the end of a day spent managing everyone else's needs, a hymn hummed softly rather than a radio program half listened to, perhaps a different specific texture, but the same underlying architecture, the same hard-won, quietly guarded stillness. I mention these variations not to suggest any of them require a fully separate story. Each one certainly deserves one, more than one, told with far more care and specificity than I can offer within this particular evening's narration, but simply to widen, one final time, the frame of who we are actually picturing when we say a 1950s housewife, a phrase that flattens, in popular memory, into a single narrow image, blonde and aproned and standing in a spotless kitchen from a magazine advertisement, when the actual reality was considerably richer, considerably more varied, and considerably more resilient than that flattened image ever quite manages to convey. Whoever she was, in whatever specific kitchen, speaking whatever specific language in her private prayers, carrying whatever specific history in the objects she kept close at hand, she shared this much, I think, with every other version of herself we have imagined tonight. A day spent almost entirely in service of others, an hour, claimed however quietly, however briefly, that belonged to no one but herself, and a particular, hard-earned peace, arriving finally somewhere between 11 and midnight, that made the whole exhausting architecture of her day feel, if only for that hour, entirely worth it. Food itself, at this particular hour, took on a different character than it held at any other point in the day, no longer a meal to be planned and executed and served to an audience, but something small and private, prepared for an audience of one. A slice of toast, perhaps, spread thin with butter and a little jam, eaten standing at the counter rather than seated properly at the table, a small break from the formality that governed nearly every other meal in the household. Warm milk, for the nights when sleep seemed likely to prove stubborn, heated slowly in a small saucepan, and stirred with a spoonful of sugar and sometimes a pinch of nutmeg grated fresh from a whole nut kept in the spice cabinet, specifically for this purpose, a habit passed down from her own mother, who had sworn by its ability to ease a restless mind toward sleep, and who had likely inherited the same belief from her own mother before her. A small unbroken chain of women warming milk in slightly different kitchens across a span of decades none of them could have fully articulated. Leftover cake from a birthday earlier in the week, a slice cut a little smaller than she would have served anyone else, eaten slowly with a fork directly from a small plate rather than the good china, savoured in a way that felt distinctly different from eating the same cake at the actual party, surrounded by people and conversation and the need to appear gracious about how delicious everything was. Alone, at 11 at night, she could simply taste it, notice whether the frosting had been sweet enough, whether the cake itself had turned out properly moist, small private assessments that mattered to her far more than any compliment offered by a guest earlier in the week, because these were the honest opinions of the one person whose judgment on her own cooking she actually fully trusted. There is a version of home, I think, that only reveals itself at this particular hour, in this particular kind of solitude, and it is worth trying to name directly before we finally let her rest. During the day, home is a place of function, a stage on which 100 small performances of care and competence and hospitality play out continuously, each one witnessed and implicitly judged by a husband, by children, by the occasional visiting neighbour, by the whole invisible weight of a culture that held very specific opinions about what a properly run home should look and feel and smell like. But at 11 o'clock, once the audience has fully departed into sleep, home becomes something else entirely, something closer to its original, simplest meaning, not a stage at all, but simply the place where she is safe enough, familiar enough, entirely herself enough, to stop performing altogether. This, I suspect, is the actual reason this particular hour meant so much to so many women of this era, more than the tea itself, more than the specific magazine or the specific radio program or the specific stitch pattern currently occupying her needle. It was the 1 hour of the day in which home fully became, rather than merely represented, safety. The 1 hour in which the house around her was not something she was actively maintaining and presenting and defending against judgment, but simply, quietly, holding her, the way it held her sleeping children and her sleeping husband, without asking anything further of her at all. And perhaps that is worth carrying with you tonight, whatever your own home looks like, whatever decade or country or particular arrangement of walls and rooms currently holds you as you listen to this. Somewhere in your own day, however full it has been, however much it has asked of you, there is very likely some small hour or even some small handful of minutes that belongs entirely to you, claimed quietly, without fanfare, the same way she claimed hers. If you have not yet found it, I hope you do, and if you have, I hope tonight, drifting off to sleep with her, you feel a little less alone in having needed it, and a little more grateful for whatever small ritual you have built to protect it, whether that is tea gone cold in a favourite cup, or a book left open on the nightstand, or simply 5 quiet minutes at a window before the day finally, fully lets you go. One more small thread is worth following before we close, and that is what became, over the following years, of the daughters who grew up watching this particular ritual unfold from the far side of the stairs, unable to sleep on certain nights and creeping partway down to sit on a step and simply observe their mother in this unguarded, private hour. Many of these daughters would grow into a considerably different world than the one their mothers had inhabited, attending college in numbers their mothers could rarely have imagined for themselves, entering careers and professions that would have seemed entirely closed off only a decade or two earlier, marrying later, or differently, or in some cases not at all, building lives that diverged sharply, in their outward shape, from the specific pattern of housework and domesticity we have spent this whole evening describing. And yet a great many of these same daughters, women who would go on to hold jobs their mothers never had access to, who would raise their own children within marriages structured quite differently than their parents had been, still describe, decades later, some version of this exact same evening hour in their own adult lives. A cup of tea after everyone else has gone to bed, a book read slowly, a chapter at a time, across several nights, a particular chair in a particular corner of their own home that has become, through years of exactly this kind of quiet nightly use, unmistakably theirs. The specific outward architecture of their days looks almost nothing like their mothers' days did. The underlying need for this hour, this particular hour, this small claimed territory at the far edge of an otherwise fully occupied day, seems to have survived every single change the intervening decades brought, passed down not through explicit teaching, but through something closer to inheritance, an instinct absorbed simply from years of watching a mother sit quietly at a kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to sleep. I find something genuinely moving in that continuity, More moving, honestly, than almost anything else this particular story has to offer. The specific tools change. The specific rules governing what a woman's day should look like change, and change again, and will surely keep changing. But this one small thing, the need for an hour that belongs to no one but yourself, claimed quietly at the end of a day spent largely in service of others, seems to persist across every version of womanhood this century has produced, a thread running unbroken from her particular kitchen, in her particular decade, all the way to whatever kitchen or bedroom or quiet corner you yourself might be sitting in tonight, listening to this, your own version of her tea already going cold beside you, whether you have quite noticed that yet or not. There is a particular kind of grace, I think, in an ordinary life lived well, in small daily acts of care extended patiently toward the people you love, in a house kept warm and a family kept fed, and a marriage tended, however imperfectly, across years that eventually add up to an entire shared life. History books rarely have much room for this kind of grace. It does not photograph dramatically. It rarely makes it into the record at all, beyond the occasional letter or diary entry that happens, by pure chance, to survive the passage of decades. But it happened, night after night, in kitchen after kitchen, across a whole generation of women whose individual names we will mostly never know, and whose collective legacy, I think, deserves rather more gratitude than history has generally offered it. So here, at the very end of this long, quiet evening we have spent together, let me simply say thank you to her, whoever she specifically was, and to every woman like her, in every decade before and since, who has ever claimed a small quiet hour at the end of an exhausting day, not for any grand reason, not for any purpose that would ever make it into a history book, but simply because she needed it, and because she had, somewhere along the way, learnt that needing it was reason enough. Before we finally let the lamp go dark, I want to return one last time to the sheer physical geography of that kitchen, because I think there is a real comfort in fixing it firmly in your mind before sleep takes you fully under. The table with its chrome legs and its formica top, cool under her forearms where her robe sleeve has ridden up slightly. The window above the sink, black now, holding nothing but her own faint reflection and the suggestion of a yard beyond it. The stove, its dials all confirmed off, the small pilot light glowing its steady, reassuring blue somewhere deep inside it. The refrigerator humming, falling silent, humming again. The clock above the doorway, its hands having moved further than she quite intended, though not so far that she regrets a single minute of it. Somewhere above her, through the ceiling, the particular weight and rhythm of her husband's sleep, steady enough now that she could set a clock by it if she needed to. Somewhere further down the hall, two smaller versions of that same steady rhythm, her children breathing evenly through whatever dreams currently hold them, dreams she will never know the content of, will only ever glimpse second-hand tomorrow morning in whatever fragmented, half-remembered account they offer over breakfast. The whole house, in other words, entirely full, entirely accounted for, every person she loves most in the world currently safe within these particular walls, held by a structure she has spent years learning to keep warm and dry and functioning, however humble it might look from the outside compared to grander houses on grander streets. She rises from the table at last, the chair's legs making their familiar small scrape against the linoleum, a sound she has heard so many thousands of times it no longer registers as sound at all, simply as the final punctuation mark closing out another ordinary, extraordinary day. The cup goes to the sink, the lamp goes dark, and the kitchen, for a few hours now, belongs to no one at all, simply waiting, patient and empty and faintly warm, for the coffee percolator that will, in a matter of hours, begin the entire beautiful, exhausting cycle over again. Let that image hold you now, the way it holds her. A dark, quiet kitchen, a house full of sleeping people who are loved and safe and entirely unaware of how much quiet effort it took to make them so, and somewhere just beyond the edge of sleep, waiting patiently the way it always does, a morning that has not arrived yet and does not need to be thought about now, not for many hours still. There is only this, the dark, the quiet, the particular, hard-earned piece of a day finally, fully finished. One further small ritual belongs here before we close, something a good many women practiced without ever quite naming it as a ritual at all, and that was the simple act of standing for just a moment at the foot of the stairs before finally climbing them, looking back once at the darkened kitchen behind her, at the shape of the table and the chairs and the window, all of it barely visible now in the faint residual light from the hallway, and feeling in that brief pause a kind of quiet accounting take place, unbidden and wordless. The day had happened. It had asked a great deal of her, and she had given it, mostly without complaint, and now it was finished, and the house stood around her exactly as it should, warm and settled and full of the people she loved most, and there was nothing more to check, nothing more to fix, nothing more to give tonight. She would simply nod, sometimes, at nothing in particular, a small private gesture of completion, before turning and climbing the stairs toward whatever rest the night still had left to offer her. There is one final image I want to leave you with before we close, and it has nothing to do with kitchens or chores or any of the specific rituals we have spent this evening cataloguing so carefully. It is simply this: a whole country in this particular decade dotted with millions of these small, unremarkable, deeply significant hours happening simultaneously, night after night, in towns and cities and farmhouses scattered from one coast to the other, each one entirely unaware of all the others, and yet each one, in its own quiet way, part of the exact same larger pattern. A mother in Ohio setting down her mending, a mother in rural Georgia fanning herself on a porch swing, a mother in a Brooklyn apartment listening to a train pass somewhere beyond her window, a mother in a small Montana ranch house checking the stove one final time before climbing the stairs. All of them, at roughly the same hour, in roughly the same posture, doing roughly the same thing, which was nothing at all, and which was, at the very same time, everything that actually mattered. There is a particular quality of comfort, too, in knowing that this exact scene, this exact quiet hour, was never really about the specific decade at all. However much we have spent this evening dwelling inside its particular details, its percolators and its party lines, and its carefully rationed hours of solitude, it was about something considerably older than any single decade, an instinct that predates the post-war suburb by centuries, the same instinct that sent a woman to sit by a hearth long after her household had gone to sleep in some medieval cottage, or to walk quietly through a moonlit courtyard in a house from an even older century, seeking, in whatever form her own particular era allowed, the same simple thing: a little time, a little quiet, a little permission to simply exist, unwatched, unneeded, entirely herself, before the demands of tomorrow arrived to claim her all over again. I think about that image more than almost any other detail from this whole story. The sheer scale of it, an entire generation of women, connected not by any shared conversation or shared plan, but simply by the shared unspoken understanding that this hour, wherever and however it fell, was worth protecting. Nobody organized it. Nobody wrote the manual. It simply happened, over and over, across a whole vast country, because the need underneath it was so basic, so universal, that it required no organizing at all. A day spent giving, an hour, at the very end of it, spent quietly, privately, simply being. That is where I will leave her and leave you tonight. Not in any single kitchen, not in any single decade, but in that whole wide scattered constellation of quiet, lamplit windows, each one holding its own version of the exact same piece, stretching from coast to coast across a country now fully asleep, resting at last, the way you are resting now, the way she rested then, the way every tired, faithful, quietly extraordinary woman before either of you has rested at the end of every ordinary day that ever demanded everything of her and received, in return, everything she had left to give. And if, somewhere in the years since, that particular tradition of the quiet, private hour has grown a little harder to find, buried under busier schedules and brighter screens, and a culture that seems increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of doing nothing at all for the sheer sake of it, I hope tonight offered you a small reminder of how simple it once was, and how simple it still can be. No special equipment required, no particular skill, just a chair and a few quiet minutes, and permission, freely given to yourself, to want nothing further from them wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day led you here, to this exact moment, listening to a voice describe a kitchen that stopped existing decades before you were likely even born. I hope some small part of that peace has settled over you as well. The tea does not need to be real. The kitchen does not need to be yours. The feeling, though, that particular feeling of a long day finally, fully releasing its grip, is available to you tonight, right now, in whatever room you are actually sitting or lying in, exactly the way it was available to her. Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. Let the last of today's tension drain out through your shoulders, down your arms, out through your fingertips, the same slow release she felt at that kitchen table, night after night. For years she never once bothered to count. The day is done. There is nothing left to do, nothing left that anyone needs from you, not tonight, not right now, only this, the quiet, the dark, and rest, arriving now the way it always eventually does, gently, without announcement, closing the day the same soft way it closes every day, until there is nothing left at all but sleep. Let yourself drift, the way she is drifting now, thoughts loosening their grip one at a time, the day's remaining tension finally, fully releasing from your shoulders the same way it released from hers, sitting at that table in that particular pool of warm lamplight, in a kitchen that has long since ceased to exist in the physical world but that lives on, somehow, in every retelling of an evening like this one. The tea is cold now. It has been cold for a while. She does not mind. Some things are not meant to be finished, only enjoyed for as long as they last, and then set gently aside, unregretted. Upstairs, her husband turns once in his sleep, settles, goes still again. Down the hall, her children breathe slow and even behind doors left slightly open, the small night light in the hallway casting its familiar low glow across a floor she has walked 1,000 times, in the dark, without ever once needing to look down. The house holds them all, gently, the way it has held them every night for years, and will go on holding them, night after night, long after this particular evening has folded itself into the quiet, uncountable pile of all her other evenings, indistinguishable from each other in memory, and yet each one, in its own way, complete. If you are still awake with me, and I suspect by now you may not be, which is exactly as it should be, I want you to picture the very last thing she does before finally standing up from that kitchen table. She rests both hands flat on its surface for just a moment, an old worn habit, a small private gesture that means nothing in particular and everything at once, a kind of quiet acknowledgement of the day now properly, fully finished. Then she rises, carries the cold cup to the sink, rinses it once under water she does not bother to warm, and sets it upside down on the drying rack to wait for morning. The lamp above the stove goes off last, the kitchen settling into full darkness behind her as she climbs the stairs, one hand trailing lightly along the banister, feet finding each familiar step without needing any light at all to guide them. And that is where we will leave her tonight, climbing quietly toward a bed already warm with her husband's sleeping presence, toward a house that has once again made it safely through to the far side of an ordinary day. Tomorrow the alarm will ring, the coffee will go on, the whole gentle machinery of her particular life will start itself up again, exactly as it always does. But that is tomorrow's concern. Tonight she rests, and so I hope will you. I think what has stayed with me most, turning this particular story over these past weeks while I put it together for you, is not any single fact about the decade itself, not the etiquette or the appliances or the particular brand of coffee percolator sitting on her stove. It is simply the shape of that hour, carved so carefully and so quietly out of a day that offered her very little room for anything resembling leisure. Nobody taught her to claim it, nobody rewarded her for taking it. She simply understood, the way an entire generation of women before her had understood, and the way I suspect most of us still understand somewhere beneath all our modern noise and modern conveniences, that a life spent entirely in service of others' needs, somewhere, a door that closes gently behind you, if only for an hour, if only until the tea goes cold. We do not know most of their names. We will never read most of their letters, tucked away as they are in boxes in attics that will eventually be cleared out by grandchildren who never got the chance to ask what those particular pages meant. But I like to think that something of that hour survives anyway, passed down not through any specific memory, but through something quieter, an inherited instinct in the women, and increasingly the men, who came after them, to protect some small corner of the evening as fiercely, as gently, as she once did. A cup of tea, A book left open on the nightstand, a window cracked to let the night air in, small rituals, easy to overlook, and somehow, when you trace them all the way back, containing an entire lost world within them. Thank you for spending this evening with me, and with her, whoever she was to you tonight, a version of your own grandmother perhaps, or simply a stranger from a decade none of us actually lived through, made real for an hour through nothing more than words spoken quietly into a dark room. If this kind of story is the kind of company you find yourself wanting more of at the end of a long day, I would be genuinely grateful if you considered subscribing to Sleepy Old World, and if you have made it this far, truly this far, into the small hours of the night alongside me, I would love, whenever you wake and find this comment box in front of you, to know where you were listening from tonight and what your own particular version of this quiet hour looks like. Whatever decade, whatever kitchen, whatever cup of something warm happens to be going cold in your own hands right now. There is one more small comfort worth naming before we let her go entirely, and it is simply this. She never once needed anyone's permission for this hour, though she rarely would have described it in such deliberate terms. Nobody granted it to her. No employer scheduled it. No husband formally approved it. No rule book anywhere instructed her that this particular stretch of time, 11 o'clock until whenever her own eyes finally grew too heavy to continue, belonged to her alone. She simply took it, night after night, the way a plant leans quietly toward whatever light happens to be available to it, without asking, without announcing the lean, simply growing in the direction that sustained it. There is something worth learning from that, I think. Something that has very little to do with the specific decade or the specific kitchen, and everything to do with a truth that seems to hold steady across every era humans have ever lived through. Rest is rarely given. It is claimed quietly by whoever needs it badly enough to reach for it, however small the reaching, however modest the hour finally won. And so, on that note, let the lamp go dark for good tonight, both hers and, in whatever way feels true for you, your own. Let the last of the day's noise settle into silence. Let whatever tomorrow will ask of you wait patiently on the other side of a full night's sleep, the way it always eventually does, the way it waited for her, the way it will wait for whoever comes after both of us, night after night, for as long as anyone keeps needing a quiet hour at the end of an ordinary, extraordinary day. Sleep well tonight. You have earned it, the same as she did, the same as every woman who ever sat alone in a lamplit kitchen at the end of a long day and simply, quietly let herself rest. The house is quiet, the day is done. Close your eyes and let it all go now, gently, the way a lamp goes out at the end of a long good evening. Good night, friend. I will see you next time.